Hello, welcome to the sequel of What If Luffy Was Raised by WhiteBeard, called What If Luffy Was Son of WhiteBeard. Please like and subscribe, 12 likes for next part. Enjoy. Luffy sat on a cliffside looking down at the water, a small smile on his face as he took in the wind off the sea. I expected to find you where the party is at, not over here. Nami had come up beside him and sat down on the ledge as well. Yeah, I'll go back in a moment, just relaxing a bit. Luffy said, looking at her and smiling as well. We'll be leaving tomorrow, right? She asked him, her eyes turned towards the sea. He nodded. I've got what I came to the East Blue for, so we should probably make our way back to paradise. He had his nakama now, so there wasn't any real reason to stay here any longer than needed. Is the Grand Line, or rather paradise, that bad? She asked him, trying to hide the anxiety in her voice, but Luffy gave his small laugh. It can be, but I have faith in my crew. He smiled at her again as she relaxed, because her captain was the strongest she had ever met, stronger than Arlong. I'll be counting on you, Captain. She said, standing up, but Luffy pointed to something behind him, his head tilted in confusion. Whose grave is that? He asked as Nami placed her hand on the wooden cross, staring down at it. It's my mother's, was all she said. He nodded once more. You've made her proud, Luffy replied quietly as she walked away, a small smile on her own face now, because she so hoped those words were true. She hoped that after all these years, she had made Bellemere proud of her. Ma, Pops, we're coming your way soon. He smiled before jumping up and following the delicious scent of meat back to the village party. Usopp was singing his praise on top of a bunch of wood, and Zoro was drinking his weight in booze. Sanji was helping with the meals as Luffy jumped in and grabbed a few stacks of meat and shoving a few in his pockets just in case. Boy, you did a good thing. A man wearing a pinwheel had come up beside Luffy as he was stuffing a bunch of meat in his face. I did? He asked through a full mouth, spitting food everywhere. Yes, you set us free. He looked at the party in front of him as Luffy swallowed. I don't care about that, I just wanted to free Nami. Luffy admitted, causing the man to chuckle, then turned to him. Nami will be going with you, correct? He asked, and Luffy nodded, since there was no way he was leaving without her now. Then let me make this clear to you, boy, if you do anything to take away that smile of hers, I'll come kill you myself, got it? He shouted at Luffy, who knew the protective nature of a parent figure, so he nodded his head and smiled. Got it, but I don't really plan on taking anything from her, he said, but the man was already leaving to give his respects to a grave on a cliff. What's with this place? Luffy said before going back in for more meat, forgetting anything else but the rumbling of his stomach once more. When morning came, Luffy and the others were on the Mary as it began to pull away from shore. Shouldn't we wait for her? Zoro asked. Since they came all this way, he didn't think Luffy would leave without his navigator. Nah, she'll be here in a moment. Luffy knew Nami needed to say goodbye in her own way, much like he had to his own family. Nami saw the piles of people waiting at the shore, so taking a deep breath she ran through them, causing them to scream out at her, begging her to wait a moment so they could say goodbye properly. Once she had finished, she jumped to the railing of Luffy's ship and smirked at everyone before dropping the wallets on the deck and winking back. "You damn brat." Some yelled, but then wished her well as she joined the others who were shaking their heads. "Don't forget, boy." The man on the shore yelled as Luffy waved in response, because he wouldn't. Luffy would never do anything to hurt Nami or his family ever. So do we go straight for the entrance to the Grand Line right away? Usopp asked Luffy, who shook his head. We have one more stop to make, Luffy said as he walked into the men's quarters and grabbed an envelope, bringing it out to everyone. My ma said to give this to you guys before we came to home waters, he said, not bothering to read it earlier. A letter from one of the WhiteBeard pirates. Usopp said, carefully looking at the letter. Not just any pirate either, but Marco the Phoenix himself. Zoro smiled, but it was Nami who snatched the letter from Luffy's hand, opening it up. If you're Luffy reading this, please don't throw it away. It is important information for your crew, so put it back until you're ready to go to the Grand Line again. Nami started looking at Luffy, who began to pout at Marco's lack of faith in him. If you're not Luffy, then we're all happy to have you around. He's hard to handle, but has a good heart, so take care of him for us. We know he was raised here in paradise, but you were probably not, therefore we wish for you to have a good start. Before you go any further, please stop at the last island before the entrance to Reverse Mountain, there you will find anything you need to survive. For his navigator, we suggest you find a log pose, your compass won't work on the sea, and entering without one may look childish. We've provided a picture to ensure you pick up the right one. If any of you know hockey or are starting it, please continue. Luffy is expected to teach you as much as possible, so don't let him off that easy. To the chef, Luffy eats more than a normal human being should, please ensure he doesn't starve or overeat. All of us are now counting on you all to take care of our Luffy. Good luck, Marco, 1st Division Commander. Nami read out, then began to look for the picture she would need. He sounded so stiff. Usopp said, looking at Luffy, who was making a weird face. It sounds like one of his reports. He probably wrote that while doing paperwork. Luffy knew Marco went into autopilot during his office duty, so it was kind of expected that his note sounded like that. He cares enough to write it, that's all that matters. Nami said, then looked at them all. I guess we should set the sails towards Louge Town then. She said, and Luffy nodded. His navigator knew the way so he would follow her. Let's go everyone. He cheered as a seagull flew above him, dropping a newspaper on the deck, surprising Luffy, but Nami was the one who picked it up and gasped in surprise. Luffy, this is X. When Thatch woke up he began his morning rituals to prepare for the day ahead. He would start heating the ovens and setting the different chefs to where they needed to be. Thatch enjoyed giving some of his division a day off of cooking, so he made sure to have a schedule set to help him know who likes cooking breakfast and who enjoys dinner. Once he got the people up who were supposed to help him that morning, he would then hunt down the newspaper because the intel division would have his head if they didn't know what was happening around the world. I wonder what's happening today. He said, picking up the paper. The seagull must have come earlier today since a few papers were on the deck waiting to be picked up. Grabbing a few of them in his arms, a piece of paper floated to the ground, making him turn back and stare at it. What's this? He asked, putting the papers down and picking up the new one. The moment his eyes reached the picture of a smiling boy wearing a straw hat, Thatch's smile went from shock to pure excitement as his eyes drifted down to the bounty at the bottom. Oh, your ma isn't going to like this kid. Thatch laughed, then decided to quickly bring the papers to the galley before going to wake his phoenix friend. It's what, 6 a.m. Thatchioi? Marco asked, opening his door and glaring at the red deed that then put the bounty poster in Marco's face, causing the blonde's lazy eyes to widen. No way, he said, taking the poster, and Thatch nodded in excitement. I'm going to wake up our wonderful Fire Fist and show him the news. Want to come with me? Thatch asked Marco, who had yet to even really throw clothes on, still in his pajama bottoms and shirtless. Give me a moment, Yoi. Marco slammed the door closed and threw some proper clothing on, but not before pinning the poster to his wall, where Luffy's smile could shine for him day and night. You have more of those, right, Thatchioi? Marco asked once he had opened his door, causing the man to laugh in response. I knew you'd probably steal that one, so yeah, I grabbed some from the other newspapers. Thatch said, pulling a few rolled up ones out of a pocket in his pants. But we need to let the crew know that Luffy's finally become a known pirate, Yoi. Marco said, following beside him towards the second division. A known pirate with quite the starting bounty. Thatch said with a smile, knocking on Ace's door, waking the brunette up. Breakfast is in an hour, go away. Ace said, because as much as he loved to eat he loved his sleep just as much. This might wake you up. Thatch said, doing what he did to Marco and putting Luffy's bounty poster in his face. That's, he said, taking it as his smile grew across his face. We need to let everyone know. Ace jumped around in excitement because Luffy was finally being put on the map. Might want to throw some pants on, Brad. As much as we love to see you shirtless, I don't think the nurses can handle seeing you in your boxers. Thatch laughed, making Ace laugh with him. Might be worth the test, right? A spark started burning in his dark coal eyes. I'm going to wake the old man and show him the news, Yoi. Marco left Ace and Thatch to pass on the poster and news to everyone else while making his way to the old man's room. Marco knocked at his father's door and waited for him to be called into where Pops was awake but not out of bed. What's happened, Marco? He asked as Marco smiled. News on Luffy, Yoi. He said, passing the bounty poster towards the old man, who looked it over and smiled. It's rare for a bounty like this in the East Blue. Pop said, but smiled down at the laughing boy in the picture. 45 million, that's higher than Ace's starting bounty was, Yoi. Marco knew Ace was now going to work hard to always stay one step ahead of Luffy to help give the boy something to catch up to. It says in the paper apparently he took out almost every strong pirate in the East Blue, and knowing him, that was only the start of the many who will fall trying to stop him, Yoi. East Blue was weak compared to other seas, so it was no surprise that Luffy was able to take them out, but Marco knew that once he hit paradise again, people weren't going to be that kind. So he'll be back in home waters soon, Pop said before laughing. Shortly now, by the looks of it, Yoi. Marco couldn't wait to have Luffy back in home waters where he could watch over him. When he comes our way we shall greet him, but not until then, Marco. Pop said, knowing the protectiveness his eldest son hadn't decreased at all since Luffy had left. I know, but now I can at least keep an eye on him, Yoi. Also the papers will start to send news of his adventure towards them, which made Marco smile. We had him for 17 years and now he's all grown up with a large bounty. Marco took it all in because it meant that everyone would be after Luffy's head. Should he ever call for us we will come to him, he's not alone, Marco. Pops reassured his son because it was the truth, if Luffy ever called their names they'd be there as soon as they could. Marco stood up, leaving the poster with the old man. It seems our family has discovered the news and as their older brother I have to go ensure the party doesn't get too out of hand, Yoi. Pops laughed, letting Marco leave, closing the door behind him. The new era of pirates is beginning. What changes will you bring with you, my son? X. Sabo was working with his new team consisting of a red-headed girl and a fishman who Jinbei had introduced him to. Sabo, we need to move now. The girl Cola said to him, puffing her cheeks at him, showing her annoyance. But we finished the job easy enough, can't I enjoy my meal in peace? He asked her since he didn't see any real reason to leave all this food behind him to waste. But Hack is waiting for us at the ship already. She said to him, but his stubbornness was on par with Ace and Luffy's. Yeah, I'll be there soon, I promise. He said as she stomped off to let the fishman known as Hack know that Sabo was taking his time leaving the restaurant again. Wow, this new rookie's really rising, someone said behind Sabo, looking at a newspaper. No big deal, the kid took out the East Blue Pirates, he'll probably get crushed once he hits the Grand Line. Another said to the man as Sabo was listening in. Monkey D. Luffy, huh, maybe just in case we should remember his name. With those words, Sabo had turned himself around in his chair and snatched the paper out of the man's hand. Luffy? He said as the man scowled at him in confusion and anger. Sabo ignored the man and continued to read the news, taking in as much information about his little brother as possible. 45 million, huh, you sure need to come back to home waters with a bang, don't you, Lou? Sabo chuckled, stealing the poster. Maybe I'll make a call to Ace and everyone, see if they know the news yet. Sabo threw the rest of the paper except the article and the bounty back at the men before walking out, his meal finished. X. Mihik was sitting on his ship reading the paper, a smirk on his face at the bounty poster in front of him. You've only been away from your family for a few months at best and already have a bounty? Mihik asked out loud, but turned his sails towards an island where a drunk was probably relaxing. His family probably already knows with how protective they are. Mihik mused, imagining a great emperor's crew partying this very moment to welcome their little brother back into the pirating world. It's Hawkeye, Mihik. Someone yelled from the shore as the warlord stepped on the sand, glaring at them with a lazy expression. I'm looking for your captain. He said as a few people then began to lead him to their drunk red-haired captain. It's too early for this. Shanks said, looking up at Mihik with shadows covering his face. Come to spar, Mihik? Shanks asked the man who scowled. I refuse to fight a disabled man. Mihik said casually as Shanks laughed, knowing Mihik was a little sore about him losing his arm, but since it was for Luffy, he secretly forgave him for it. What brings you all the way to my vacation island? Shanks asked, because Mihik rarely went out of his way for another. I thought you might like to see this. Mihik then put in front of him a poster of a laughing boy wearing a straw hat. Luffy? Shanks yelled, grabbing the poster and staring hard at it. Others had come to gather around, a smile on all of their faces at the sight of their littlest fan. He's gotten so big, Shanks looked fondly at the boy, hearing his laughter in his mind. He has, but his attitude hasn't changed much. Mihik said, causing Shanks to look up at the swordsman. And you would know this how? Shanks asked. Because I ran into him and his small crew not that long ago. Mihik said, but Shanks didn't look away. And his crew is still standing. Mihik could destroy crews if he felt the urge some days. I rather enjoyed my time, his first mate is quite the swordsman, with a little more training he might become even better. Shanks' eyes widened because that was a compliment coming from the greatest swordsman. Deciding not to spoil the mood because even Ben was shocked by the compliment, Shanks raised his empty mug to his crew. I say we celebrate to welcome Luffy back home. A loud cry had been heard by almost everyone around him. It appears you've already done just that. Mihik said, looking at the empty barrels around him. That was just a warm-up party, now we can move on to the actual one. Shanks laughed, passing Mihik a drink which he reluctantly took. Drink up, my friend. This is for Luffy after all. Shanks said, his smile annoying Mihik, but he drank anyway, mostly to shut the stupid drunk up. That's it. Shanks cheered, making Ben shake his head. Welcome back, Luffy. X. Garp was sitting at his desk looking at the poster with a small frown on his face. He always knew Luffy would follow this path, his heritage along with his background guaranteed he had no other choice. If only my stupid son had given you to me, things would have been different. He tried to reassure himself, but even he knew that Luffy would follow his own path no matter who raised him. Your damn pirate family will be celebrating, no doubt. He smiled, looking out the window, having already experienced this with Ace. When Ace got his first bounty, he had made his way to the old pirate's ship just to shout at him and greet him with the fist of love. Luffy had still been there at the time, greeting his grandpa with smiles and laughter, so he couldn't hit the other child. It seemed that the blonde had left to go his own way, and goodness only knew where he was right now. Sighing once more, Garp opened a secret space in his drawer where the transponder snail linking him to the WhiteBeard pirates was, but also alongside it was Ace's many bounty posters and news clippings on the boy. Placing Luffy's bounty poster in the drawer, Garp would be keeping track of the kid's adventures alongside his other grandchild's. After all, what kind of grandpa would he be if he didn't scrapbook everything his grandchildren did? Closing the drawer again, Garp stood up from his desk and went to the window, opening it up. The new generation might be strong, but nothing will stop my fist of love, not even you, Luffy. X. Captain. A white bear called, carrying a newspaper in his hands, meaning the seagull that carried it had come early. What's wrong? He asked his crewmate, who pushed the paper into the pirate captain's hands, making said man look down at it. Luffy, Law said in surprise, but then gave a smile looking at the picture. It's that boy from all those years ago. Beepo said, alerting the other members of the Heart Pirates to come over and see what was going on. You're right. But I thought he was a white-beard pirate. Penguin asked, looking down at the poster as Law read the article and smiled the entire time. He's keeping a promise. Law said, remembering how the boy said he'd set out at 17, the memory of spending time with the kid was quite a fond one for the doctor. Ah, so he really did mean it when he said that. I thought he'd change his mind and stay with the crew he already was with. Someone else said as Law shook his head, knowing the determination that came from the chosen people. He's a D. They always follow through on their words. Luffy, no, Mugiwara is no different. Law said as a few laughed. Law stood up and walked to his main deck since his submarine had come up from being underwater for so long. I hope we meet again soon, Mugiwara. Law said to the wind, hoping it would catch the boy's sails and bring them towards one another. X. Captain Smoker was shaking as he looked at the picture on the bounty poster. That damn brat. What the hell does he think he's doing? Smoker growled out, causing his partner to look at him in concern. Smoker-san? She asked, not understanding why he was so mad. Becoming a pirate after I trained him so hard. Even though he was angry, Smoker had read the article and couldn't hate the boy even if he had chosen something Smoker hadn't expected. From what he had read, Luffy had saved an entire island from the hands of a pirate ruler, which was something the Marines were supposed to be doing. Do you know this boy, Smoker-san? She asked, taking the bounty poster from him. Yes, I knew him when he was a brat, all three of them actually. He had gotten a bounty poster of Ace and wasn't very happy to see it, so he did some research into Ace, finding nothing. The boy was a mystery, which was unexpected since he believed him to be one of Vice Admiral Garp's grandchildren. Smoker stood up, needing air and to get away from that picture with the high bounty on it, taunting him. When I see you again, I'm going to beat some sense into you, boy. Make way to Lobe Town, that's where he'll be going first if he's heading back to the Grand Line. A few cries had been heard as he gave his order, and the Marine captain made his way to the small island, ready to teach his old friend a lesson. You're telling the truth, right? Luffy grabbed Usopp by the shoulders and looked the man in the eyes as Usopp's sweat dropped at Luffy. Yeah, I've heard that the place we're heading to is the birthplace of the Pirate King Gold Roger. Usopp said to Luffy, who then proceeded to jump around the merry, letting out cheers and laughter. It's also the place they executed him, Luffy. Nami said, looking up from one of her books at the jumping boy she called her captain. But he was born there. Luffy said in more excitement as the crew sighed, knowing that once Luffy had set his sights on something there was no stopping him. I don't care about the Pirate King's birth or death. Zoro started yawning loudly before Luffy growled at him for those words. What I care about is getting some new katanas. Your uncle broke my other two and I don't like fighting without three. Zoro said before looking at Nami, who was leaning on her hand smirking at Zoro, berry signs sparkling behind her brown eyes. Oh, and do you have any money to buy those katanas with? She asked him, a slight tone in her voice causing him to flinch. I'll be asking the treasurer for a loan, I guess, Zoro said as she looked down her nose at him, still smiling. Why, of course, I expect though a 300% interest on the money, of course. She said as Zoro paled at her, but accepted the money due to the fact he did need to get new blades. How much longer, Nami? Usopp asked, taking his telescope away from his eye to look at the reed as she stopped teasing Zoro in her own way. We should be there shortly, the wind's steady and we're on the right current. She said, so Luffy began to hop around again in excitement before making his way to the figurehead to keep a lookout. Geez, making all this loud noise while the beautiful Nami is reading, go be loud elsewhere, shitheads. Sanji shouted at them while putting a fruity treat in front of Nami. Why thank you, Sanji, I'm also feeling a little thirsty, could you make me a sweet drink? She asked him as hearts filled his eyes and he was gone. That guy, Usopp said, watching the trail of dust left behind fade away. Sanji. I want some meat as well. Luffy called into the kitchen as cursing followed that order. Honestly, Nami sighed, but smiled as well because this was her family no matter what. Boy, I think I see it. Luffy cheered to the others who came towards the figurehead to see for themselves. Yes, that's the place. Nami verified as Luffy threw his arms in the air in happiness. One last stop, then we can go home. Luffy smiled his big toothy grin as Usopp tilted his head at Luffy. By home you don't mean back to WhiteBeard's ship, right? He asked as Luffy made a face towards his sniper. No, back to home waters. I'm not going home unless I have no other choice. Though knowing Ma and the others the moment we hit home waters they'll be on our tails trying to visit. Luffy scowled at the idea of just setting sail, only to have his Ma's protective nature drag him home for what could be weeks, knowing him. Then we'll just have to move fast now won't we? Zoro asked waking up and seeing what was going on. Right. Luffy nodded but knew that if Marco or Ace wanted him home to visit they'd probably find a way to do just that even if he didn't want to visit them just yet. We'll be there soon, Zoro you should go with someone so we can locate you at all times. Nami said causing Zoro to scowl at her. Luffy why not take Usopp with you? She suggested but Luffy had wandered away not listening to her instructions anymore. I'd give it up if I were you. Usopp said to Nami giving her a sad smile, knowing how much patience she was probably using with the captain and first mate. I won't. She pouted as he shook his head at her stubbornness, this crew for better or worse fit together perfectly. See you guys. Luffy jumped from the boat to the shore once they got close enough. Luffy we need to dock the ship properly. Nami yelled at her laughing captain as he ran towards the middle of the city. Zoro taking this opportunity to jump off and run ahead as well caught Nami's eyes for a second. Zoro. She yelled, but he refused to turn back around to even look at her since he knew where he needed to go right. Like I said Nami, it's best to just give it up when it comes to those two. Usopp laughed while helping her dock the ship. Sanji can you give us a hand? Usopp turned to ask the chef who had also vanished at some point it seemed. Those three she growled closing her eyes because when she caught them she was going to pound their head so hard Luffy would actually feel it. Luffy was running around the town looking at everything excitement lighting up his eyes as the people walked by him giving him strange looks. So this is where the Pirate King was born and died he whispered to himself but something was nagging him a bit. So where am I? He had wandered the town for a while but had yet to come to where the Pirate King was actually executed. Wandering some more Luffy knew he'd find the execution place sooner or later but a feeling had stopped him in his tracks. It had been a long time he felt someone strong like his grandpa close by so closing his eyes he searched around. It felt familiar like maybe his grandpa was in the area but at the same time it was weaker than that. While searching the area a few other strong feelings hit him hard one of them he recognized instantly and smiled. You came all the way here just to see me off did you? Luffy chuckled and then ran in an opposite direction than the first one, if the person was one of his grandpa's people he didn't feel like talking to them right now. He also had another person to find before he left this place, but first he needed to find that execution place. X. Nami was following a small map towards a shop that had been written down on the note from Luffy's mother figure. She was excited to get to the place someone like Marco had recommended her to go to prepare for their adventure into the Grand Line. Welcome. Someone came towards Nami smiling kindly but eyeing her all the same. Hi, I'm looking for this. Nami put the drawing from the letter down in front of the man who eyed it before turning his dull green eyes up at her from over his large glasses. I take it you're traveling to the Grand Line then? He asked pushing the paper back towards her. Something like that. She smiled sweetly at him but something about this man was throwing her off a bit. The Grand Line isn't for children, come back with an adult and I'll give you what you want. He said turning her away, causing Nami's cheeks to tint red in anger. Paradise is for the strong and that's exactly what I am. She whispered dangerously at him as his brows rose startled she knew the other name for the Grand Line. Sounds like you are a little more knowledgeable than I expected but that isn't a good enough answer to get this from me miss. He said now putting the item she was searching for on the counter but watching her carefully. That right there isn't for me. She said pointing to the log pose as he stared at her a look crossing his face filled with confusion. Then bring the one it's for and I'll consider selling it to him. He said ready to put it away sad his game was over so soon. You misunderstand. Nami said suddenly stopping him from moving her brown eyes locked with his green. This isn't for me, it's for my captain and crew my family. It's going to be my job to ensure they make it safely through the Grand Line and if that will help me get there then I'll do whatever it takes to get it from you. She said to him as a small smile fell on his lips at the girl's words. And what does your captain want in the Grand Line? He asked her his fingers touching the log pose. He's going to become the king of the pirates. She said it with as much conviction Luffy said those words with startling the man. Closing his eyes he pushed the item towards her carefully not to break it as Nami stared at it now close to her own hands. I've seen many pirates come and go through this town asking for the same thing only to return broken from those waters. You are young so I assume your captain is just as, what makes you think you can survive in those waters when many others have fallen before you? He asked her testing her one last time. Because my captain was born there. She said looking out the window and smiling. He grew up there with the Grand Line as his home, if he can survive there and still smile like he does, then I should be able to survive there, if not for me, but for him and all of our dreams. The man laughed lightly, surprised by this strong-willed woman and a strong desire to meet this captain she spoke so fondly of. "It's yours, promise me you won't return here soon," he said, not accepting any price from her because she was kind enough to play with his game. "The next time we return here Luffy will be king," she said, taking the log pose and strapping it to her wrist. "Luffy, huh?" he said as Nami waved goodbye and left the shop. "I guess I'll keep an eye out for a pirate named Luffy." X. Smoker's hockey was good, but not the strongest out there. He had sensed the boy close by with his observation, but the moment he began to follow the feelings, the boy had moved in a whole different direction. "So we're playing cat and mouse, Luffy?" he asked, annoyed that the boy probably knew someone was chasing him so he would avoid Smoker for as long as possible. "I'm not letting you leave until I've kicked some sense into that dull head of yours," Smoker said to himself as he looked around, realizing someone was missing from his sights. Now where has that girl gone? Tashigi had been by his side only moments before, but her attentions had brought her following a green-haired swordsman into a shop selling katanas. Zoro hadn't wanted to use the money from the sea witch, but knew without her help he would become only a one-sword style, and that just didn't work for him. Finding the shop was rather difficult. He had been given directions from a few people and even a sign, but they must have been lying to him. How else could he not find the place? Not looking where he was going, because of his annoyance from the lying people, he walked right into someone else, causing her to hit the ground hard. "Watch where you're going," she shouted at him, feeling around for her falling glasses. Zoro picked them up, ready to give them back to her, but froze when she looked at him. "Kuina," he whispered quietly, and without realizing it, he had crushed her glasses in his hand. My glasses? You're going to pay me back for those," she shouted at him as he looked down at the broken shards in his hands. Sighing, Zoro passed her the broken frame and helped her up before offering her to come with him to find the witch he called Nami. "No, I want you to come with me," she said simply and started to lead the way, much to his annoyance. Following behind her, Zoro couldn't help but count the similarities between her and his old friend, and honestly it was freaking him out more than anything has in a long time. Not even seeing Luffy's rubber powers for the first time freaked him out as much as this. "I take it you don't have any money," she said to him, but he was so struck all he could do was answer her awkwardly. "You look like you're carrying a bunch of secrets, aren't you?" she asked him, turning to face him now, but seeing her face and how much she looked like her just put him off more. "What did you do? Did you walk out on your wife leaving her children? Do you have a sick mother waiting at home?" she asked him, but his mind was spinning. How did she go from him walking out on someone to being a poor woman's son? "Boy," he said to her, annoyed by her questions. "Whatever, it doesn't matter, we're here," she said, pointing to the marine base as Zoro's mouth dropped slightly, following her inside. "You will be working off your debt," she said, handing him a bucket that he dropped on the ground and crossed his arms. "Like hell I am." He knew Luffy would have a great laugh with that stupid chef if he had to mop the marine's floors. "You owe me for breaking my glasses," she reminded him as he glared at the look-alike. "I said I can get you the money for them." As much as he didn't want to ask Nami for more money, he would rather beg her than clean for the marines any day. "And I said that you will help me out." She was stubborn, he'd give her that, but he knew how to deal with stubborn, he had Luffy after all. "I'll leave this to you," she said as a fellow marine came in, addressing her. "But I just said," he began, but she had started to walk away, ignoring him. "Geez, I think she might just be worse than Luffy and Nami combined," he growled, picking up a mop that had been leaning against the wall and getting this crap done so he could go. Finishing what he was ever going to do for the marines, he placed the mops back against the wall and emptied the bucket, then wandered around. "How the hell do I get out of this maze?" he asked himself under his breath, but heard a familiar sound, one that had followed him his entire life. Looking down from a balcony, he saw the girl fighting with her swords, wooden of course, but in his mind he saw his old friend and that familiar ache beat in his heart. "Boy, you're the pirate hunter who recently joined up with Straw Hat Luffy," some random shouted as Zoro fought the urge to roll his eyes at their tone. "Recently? I've been with Luffy for a while now," Zoro said before placing a hand on his head at their looks. "That sounded weirder than it should have. What I mean is that I've been on Luffy's crew for a long time, but it doesn't matter here." He had enough, and their presence was giving him a headache. Picking up the leftover mops he had put down earlier, he used them like swords, knocking everyone out. Now what? He looked back at the girl who had finished up her fight and sighed, reaching into his pocket, pulling out some money. "I can't believe I'm using my own cash for something stupid like this. Nami would ask for double in return if I gave her loan out to someone like her though." He pulled a piece of paper from the unconscious marine and found a pen on the guy as well, writing her a small note. "For your glasses, Z. I've had it here, time to go find that stupid shop." Wandering the street, Zoro almost walked by it, but the giant swords marking the sign stopped him in his tracks. "So this must be the place then." He walked in to find the man sleeping at the counter, so he chose to look around first and see what types of swords this place had. "Boy," Zoro said loudly, causing the man to wake up with a start. "Ah. A customer. How may I help you?" he asked with the overly cheerful customer service voice. "I've only got 100,000, so what can I get with that?" Zoro asked bluntly as the man made a disappointed face. "Nothing that fancy," he said, pointing to the katana Zoro was really looking at, so the swordsman stepped away from him, no longer caring about it. "Anything will do, really. Zoro just needed some new blades until he got enough money to get the best ones." "That blade you have. Can I see it?" The shopkeeper was freaking out, but Zoro reluctantly put his blade up on the counter. This blade was a momentum of Kuina, so he didn't really like the idea of others so casually touching it. Much to Zoro's annoyance, the shopkeeper began to name prices for the sword, wanting to buy it off of him. He was about to open his mouth and tell the man off for his rudeness until his second annoyance of this town came running and asking about a sword. "Oh, it's you," she said so casually in a happy voice as he began to try breathing exercises so he didn't just beat the two people in front of him to a pulp. The girl, just to throw salt on the wound, then pushed the money he had left back towards him, stating that she didn't want it, but not before scolding him for leaving the job she had given him. Zoro had just about enough of her until she took a look at his katana that the shopkeeper was trying to buy off of him. She started to go on and on about it with information he himself hadn't heard before, so he might forgive her this one time. "You stupid girl. You're bad for my business." The shopkeeper yelled at her, but Zoro wanted to laugh at him. There was no way in hell he was going to give up Kuina's katana. The man continued to go on about some shit Zoro wasn't actually that interested in. If he really needed to, he would get the information on his sword himself. "Geez, what's his problem?" Zoro asked, walking away towards a cheap area for swords, not wanting to listen to that stupid man or the marine girl copycat anymore. "You really like swords, don't you?" the girl asked him as he began to fumble through a few of them. "Yeah, I guess." He wasn't really listening to her though. "You must be a great swordsman as you carry around 3 of them, right?" she asked him, but he didn't answer her, just check out a sword in his hands before putting it back, not satisfied with it. "There's a bounty hunter who carries 3 swords as well, he too is a fantastic swordsman named Geronimo," she said to him, causing him to look up slightly at her and nod. "I've heard that name a lot." He went back to searching through them as she nodded, but frowned. "He uses his swords for evil, killing people and bringing them in for money. That's not the true way of a swordsman," she said, crossing her arms as Zoro closed his eyes, annoyed. He needed to find someone, so bringing in bounties was enough to get food, he said as she shook her head. He went about it the wrong way. She snapped, then apologized for yelling at him, so he stopped searching to look at her. "Someday I'll free the Maitu from the scum of the world," she said as Zoro touched his own blade softly. "Wait, Ichimonji, are you going to risk trying to take him as well?" Zoro opened his blade, letting the light reflect off of it, slightly blinding her a little. "Oh, of course not. But the others I will save," she started as Zoro smirked, placing his hand on a katana in the barrel and freezing. Turning quickly, he looked at the blade, but it felt weird. It felt bloodthirsty and angry, but what weirded him out the most was that it felt like it was calling him. "That blade," she said in excitement, pulling her book out, but Zoro was attached to the katana and its strong calling that he couldn't even acknowledge her at this moment. "I can't sell you that sword," the shopkeeper yelled as the girl turned to him to argue, but Zoro pulled it out and unsheathed the blade, letting the power of it hit his hands and sting. "You crave war," he whispered to it, his eyes darting towards the marine and the shopman, then back to the blade, where he let black spread from his fingertips down the hilt and onto the silver blade itself. "So do I." He let his hockey fade as the shopkeeper started to talk to him. "Every swordsman who has ever used one of those blades has ended up dead, they're cursed," he said to Zoro, who was still looking down at the blade as if challenging it to harm him. "I'm interested, how much do you want?" he asked the shopkeeper, who began to freak, but Zoro looked at him, a dark glint behind his silver eyes. "Then how about this, your curse versus my luck?" He gave his familiar grin to the blade, the darkness turning his eyes the same color as the blade he held. "Your worst," he said to it before throwing it up in the air and sticking his arm out, letting the sword choose its master. Zoro closed his eyes, but his concentration slipped when in his mind's eye he could almost see the aura of the sword he had thrown into the air. "You can see all my attacks even before I use them, how?" Zoro asked a 14-year-old Luffy, who frowned, trying to think of how to explain it to his new friend. "It's like I see it in my head first, then you do it." But Zoro needed a better answer than that. "My brothers call it observation hockey, where you can see another's movements before they see their movements. Sometimes it's like an aura, sometimes I actually see it. I dunno what else to say." Luffy sighed, sitting down in the grass, pouting at not being able to explain it better. Sabo was the one for words, not him. "So if I train harder I can unlock this observation hockey like you?" Zoro asked Luffy, who nodded quickly. Man. Zoro hummed at that response. How will I know I've unlocked it or not? Luffy thought about it pretty hard by the way his cheeks were beginning to darken and eyes were scrunched up. You'll just know when it happens, trust me. With his arm out, Zoro saw the aura of the blade letting it fall, but instead of moving his arm away, he let the blade decide the outcome of the battle as it gracefully glided across his arm, lodging itself into the wooden floorboard. I'll take it. He said to everyone present who were all pale and shocked. Boy girl, you have good eyes for blades, pick me out a new one. It sounded more like an order, but she was too shocked to argue back at him, so she nodded silently. Wait one moment. The shopkeeper shouted as Zoro turned towards him ready to fight if he refused to sell him this sword. This blade is the best one I've got in this shop, one that can make even a weak swordsman into the best. He said, the black sheath on the blade hitting the light just perfectly catching Zoro's eyes, but his pockets knew he couldn't spend much. I can't buy that, I don't have that much on me. He reminded the man, but the shopkeeper was firm now. I don't expect anything for either of these blades, it's been a long time since I've run into a great swordsman like yourself. The man said as Zoro walked towards him to check out the blade properly. They say the katana chooses its master, I pray you have good luck. The shopkeeper said as Zoro placed his hand on the new katana before him and felt his smile grow. You're just as angry, aren't you? I'll take them both then. X. So that's the execution platform. Luffy said in awe, looking up at the wooden tower where Ace's father had been killed many years ago. Well, I'm not going to really know what it looks like from down here, so let's get a climbing. He cheered, running towards its smoker, following the feeling he had come to know to be Luffy all the way to the middle of the town. Boy kid, get down from there. A police officer shouted up at Luffy, who was enjoying the view from on top of the platform. Hey? Why pops, I'm not doing anything bad. Luffy called down to the man and his partner. This place is historical, so we can't have brats like you breaking it. He shouted up at him before some person wearing a cloak hit him in the back of the head, knocking him out. What the who the hell are you, lady? The partner of the officer asked in anger and confusion before checking on his partner. Me? She asked in a sweet voice, removing her hood and looking up at Luffy with a smirk on her beautiful face, and giggled a little. Luffy my dear, I've been looking all over for you. She said in a sweet sing-song voice that made his skin crawl slightly. Really, I've never met you before at all. He said, but his eyes were drifting up towards the sky and how dark it was suddenly getting. The East Blue rarely had major storms from what Harita told him, and this one seemed more paradise-like than anything. Pay attention to me. She shouted at Luffy, who had been ignoring her, a beautiful woman, and contemplating the weather. Sorry, but I don't know you. He said bluntly, because maybe he really would like to get off this platform since those dark clouds were moving faster than he first thought. If only Nami were here to tell him what they meant. Don't you remember, darling? Your strong fist really moved me, I was a changed woman after that. She said, placing her hand on her cheek adoringly. His eyes glazed over in memory. Luffy remained silent because honestly this woman was freaking him out in ways Marco would have been angry about. Still don't remember him? How about this, who is the most beautiful woman in this world? She asked, turning around and facing a crowd of adoring fans, mostly men with hearts in their eyes. You're my dear. A few shouted as something tried to click, but Luffy couldn't put his finger on it, maybe it wasn't that important after all. It's me, you idiot. Alvida. She finally lost her patience with Luffy, his eyes widened before he began to look around for the fat lady. What, where? She growled at his reaction while others chuckled. I'm right here. She shouted at him as he tilted his head, not really sure what to make of her. After you moved me with that powerful punch, I sought out a devil fruit that could make me strong enough to stand before you once again. I ate the smooth fruit, which has made my skin so beautiful that nothing can touch me, for it all bounces off. She said as Luffy's eyes darted upwards, rain beginning to drip but not pour. Unfortunately, my appearance has changed as well, I have lost my beautiful freckles. She said, looking so sad at the idea of her losing the weakest part of her look. Luffy wasn't sure if he should tell her or not that her freckles were not the big change. And to think I came all this way only for you to be defeated. She sighed, confusing Luffy, who once again looked towards the sky in worry. His crew was scattered around this island and a storm coming and looked really bad. I don't know what you're talking about, but I should probably go now. My crew is waiting for me and a storm's coming in, so Luffy tried to slink away, only to be pulled back by the collar of his shirt being forced down and then bound down on the platform. Looks like you let your guard down, Straw Hat brat. Luffy recognized the voice, but couldn't for the life of him put a name on the person it belonged to. This day was supposed to be fun. He was very annoyed now as the area began to fill up with both pirates and people who were screaming about the pirates in the area. Buggy pirates? Luffy asked, catching word of the name being said. That's right, Straw Hat. We have some history, you and I. You caused me the most amount of pain, and for that, my beautiful Alvida and I decided to team up and seek you out just to kill you ourselves. he said as Luffy looked around the area waiting for Zoro or Sanji to come to his rescue. Now we can begin our execution. Honestly, I expected more from you, your hockey skills are stronger than most, and yet I still was able to get behind you. Why is that, Straw Hat? Buggy asked him as Luffy looked up at him, a small smirk on his face. Because I know you won't kill me. He said with confidence that startled Buggy and many others in the area. And what makes you so sure? Huh? Buggy asked him as thunder clapped loudly close to them. Because my big brother wouldn't like that very much. He smiled, confusing Buggy a whole lot more. And why in the world should I care about your brother? He asked Luffy, who smirked more. Because he doesn't really like it when I'm in trouble. Luffy looked forwards as Sanji and Zoro entered the area. Sanji began to kick a few of the weaker pirates, while Zoro for some reason looked a bit upset. Maybe it was because Luffy was being held down, but a feeling told Luffy that it was something else entirely. Looks like my crew's giving your friend some trouble. Once I've killed you, I'm going to return to the Grand Line and become the king of the pirates. Buggy laughed, pulling out a sword as Luffy looked around a little concerned now, but he frowned in anger as the clown's words. You're wrong. I'm going to be the one who will be the king of the pirates. Luffy shouted for all to hear, freezing many in the crowd, bringing whispers from civilians, and even created a shocked marine captain named Smoker. What an idiot you are. Where's this brother you've been warning me all about, huh? Why hasn't he come to save you yet? Buggy laughed as Luffy paled, not really wanting to end it like this. This is it, Straw Hat Luffy, this is the end for you and all your wild dreams. Buggy lifted the sword in the air as a realization hit Luffy. While Zoro was strong, he couldn't fly to save him, and Sanji could only do so much on his own. He really had hoped his brother would show up and kick this clown's ass, but Luffy closed his eyes before taking a deep breath and shouting. Zoro, Nami, Usopp, Sanji. Don't be mad, but I'm dead. He shouted to them as Zoro's eyes widened at the look on Luffy's face, and shame filled both Sanji and Zoro's hearts for not being strong enough to protect their captain. Just as Buggy was bringing the blade down on Luffy, a bolt of lightning struck the blade, lighting up the platform. As Buggy screamed out in pain, Luffy laughed because the lightning tickled him a bit. Once the platform had been burnt to the ground and everyone was in shock, Luffy laughed, picking up his hat and ordered his friends to get moving. They had done enough on this island and it was time to go to paradise. Once they had gotten away from the area, Zoro grabbed Luffy by the shoulder, stopping him, letting Sanji run ahead to the ship. Zoro, Luffy said, the swordsman, looking his captain and friend in the eyes. Don't you ever do that again. He was serious, the look Luffy had given was so peaceful but downright terrifying. I'm sorry. Was all Luffy could say, because the look Zoro was giving him right now was one he had never seen before. It was a mixture of anger and worry. Just be more careful, you're supposed to have hockey, so use it, dummy. He scolded before walking ahead of Luffy, then turned back, raising a brow at the teenager. You go on ahead if you can, there's someone I need to see before I leave here. Luffy said as Zoro frowned at him and crossed his arms. Go on, it's just my brother. Zoro had never met any of Luffy's brothers, so he wasn't sure which one had come all this way to see him. If you're not back in an hour, I'm coming to look for you. He said sternly to Luffy, who laughed loudly as rain began to fall. Deal. He said before running in an opposite direction than his ship, following a feeling he knew to be his older brother's. The closer Luffy got to his brother, the wider his smile grew in size, until of course someone had to step in his way and shrink it all back down to nothing. I thought I'd find you here. Smoker said as Luffy faced him, his hand already black with hockey and an unreadable expression covering his face. I wasn't expecting to see you, I thought it was Gramps by the feeling. He admitted, but his face remained the same, unreadable. It's my job to keep pirates off of these waters, Luffy, you know that. Smoker said to him as Luffy nodded. I refuse to be a marine. He needed to make that clear. So you've chosen a path that leads to pain and suffering, Smoker shouted as Luffy growled at him. I've chosen a path that leads to freedom. I've always been a pirate, Smokey. You liked me then. Why can't you like me now? He was truly annoyed now. Monkey D. Luffy, or rather, Straw Hat Luffy, is a marine. It is my job to stop you from returning to the Grand Line. He said, pulling his jute out threateningly as Luffy let the black spread up his forearm to his elbow, preparing in a battle he knew would come. Smoker did feel a bit of regret fighting the kid he had grown to respect and care for, but this was the path he had chosen, so be it. Luffy's punches landed where he wanted them to, but Smoker was a slight bit faster than him right now, so he got in a few hits as well where Luffy couldn't see them coming. You've gotten stronger. Smoker said, appreciating the battle as Luffy nodded back at him, a smile replacing the growl. You too. He replied, ready to go back in for more, only for a blue blur to jump between them, a pipe in his hands, blocking them both off from one another. Don't you have somewhere you've got to be, Luffy? Sabo said, but the look he gave Luffy was a weird look. Man, I did promise Zoro I'd only be an hour at most, he said, crossing his arms as Smoker froze, seeing another one of his brats. You're lucky I haven't decided to call your ma and tell him about that execution platform stunt of yours. He scolded, his voice low and even angry. Well, if you had have just shown up and saved me, it wouldn't have been a big deal. Luffy was expecting Sabo to come and help him, that's why he let the clown guy pin him down, or at least, that's what he'd tell anyone if they asked about that incident. What are you doing here anyways? Luffy asked his brother, who realized that Smoker was starting to come back after the shock. Dragon wanted to make sure you had a good start. I wanted to see my little brother, so we decided to come together. Sabo shrugged as Smoker glared at the name Dragon. But it must have taken you guys forever to get here. Luffy knew Sabo would probably have come through from Paradise, and that was a long trip. Not really, we were pretty close by, so we crossed over through the calm belt. Another one of you has shown up. Will Ace make an appearance as well? Smoker asked, but Sabo frowned, which worried Luffy a bit. What's wrong with Ace? Luffy whispered softly and carefully, but Sabo shook his head. Nothing's wrong with Ace, at least nothing that I know of anyways. Luffy felt something off, but chose not to question it. If Sabo knew something, he'd tell Luffy, so nothing had to be wrong. Are you here to fight me as well, brat? Smoker asked Sabo, who dug his pipe into the ground and looked at the marine. Not really, it's just been a really long time since I've seen my baby brother. I wanted to congratulate him on his first bounty before the others did. Sabo said, smiling sweetly to Smoker, who crossed his arms looking at the blonde before him. So you came all the way here to do that, did you? Just where have you been, boy? Smoker asked Sabo, who shook his head at the man. Some things are better left unsaid, Smoker. Luffy felt the rain begin to soak into his clothes and a pair of eyes watching his back. As much as he felt like staying with Sabo and Smoker, he was a little curious about the one watching him. You can go, Luffy, I'm just glad I got to see you before Marco and the others got to. Sabo said, this time pointing his pipe towards Smoker. Your fight is with me, Luffy has places to be right now. Luffy nodded and waved goodbye to Smoker, but not before giving Sabo a hug from the side, causing the man to laugh and pat him on the head slightly, his pipe still held in place. It was good to see you, kid. Sabo whispered to Luffy, who nodded, hugging tighter before letting his brother go and running towards the presents, calling him forward. Now where were we? Sabo asked Smoker with a smile. Luffy made his way through the street soaking wet from the rain, but excitement and nervousness filling his gut. You've caused quite the trouble here, haven't you? The voice caused Luffy to stop walking, but he didn't turn around, either just listened to the man who was apparently his father. It's not like I planned on causing trouble. He pouted, but the man didn't laugh. The next generation is beginning. He said simply as Luffy stood still waiting for more. The new year is upon us, what will you do, Luffy? He asked, but the boy didn't answer him right away. Luffy took a deep breath, still refusing to turn around, and smiled. I'll do whatever I want. With that, Luffy left his father there, a smile on the man's face at his son's answer. Luffy ran the rest of the way through the rain-soaked town, with thunder crashing in the skies above him, pushing him forward. Luffy? Nami called, a raincoat over her body protecting herself from the elements. Zoro was eyeing his captain, but closed his eyes in relief when he saw Luffy was alright. What took you so long, you shithead? Sanji shouted at him as Luffy laughed. I ran into Sabo. He said to Sanji, whose eyes widened before a light smile fell across his face at the memory of the blonde brother. Sabo's here. Nami had met Sabo once before, and even Usopp knew the brother. Man, but he's going to be leaving soon, so we should go as well. Luffy ordered, and a cry could be heard as the crew began to follow their captain. Let's go, everyone. Let's go back to Paradise together. From an alleyway close by. So what did you think? Sabo asked Dragon, who stood tall even with the rain and wind brushing against his dark green cloak, the same one he had worn 17 years ago when he dropped off a baby to a pirate crew. He has much growing to do, but in time. Dragon didn't finish his sentence as Sabo smiled under his top hat, his eyes overshadowed but were filled with pride for his baby brother. He might just change the world. Sabo finished for the man who had taught him so much before following him towards a ship waiting to bring them back to the open seas. Smoker stood at the shore with his partner beside him. Her eyes looked a little red, meaning she had probably been crying at some point today. What should we do, Smoker-san? She asked him as he gripped his jute tightly, eyes narrowing towards the raging waters. We follow them, it's time we return to the Grand Line. The rain hit the deck of the Going Merry hard as the small crew pulled the sails and directed the helm, pushing the little ship further towards a glowing light in the distance. I see it. That's the entrance to the Grand Line. Nami called to the others over the thunder and rain, pointing at the light ahead. Are we really going to go now? It's storming out here. Usopp cried out in fear, his body shaking from the rain, chilling him to the bone, but also because of the idea of entering Paradise in this weather. I don't see any other reason we should stay, we've got what we needed, so let's go. Zoro said, holding onto the railing as the ship rocked over a harsh wave of dark blue pitch black. For once, and only once I agree with the moss head. We've done all we needed to in this place. I think it's time we move on to somewhere else. Sanji said the weather too wet for him to smoke. So that settles it, let's get going everyone. Luffy cheered as they drew closer to the lighthouse on the cliff, calling sailors from all four seas towards the one. Before we enter and get to see your home Luffy, there is one last thing I think we need to do. Sanji said, rolling a barrel of water out onto the deck. If it wasn't storming badly, Nami might have scolded him on wasting fresh water. What? Luffy asked him, his excitement to get back onto home waters almost at its breaking point. Sanji stood the barrel upright and placed his foot onto it, lighting a smoke finally to show he was serious. To commence our journey into the Grand Line, I promise that I will find the all blue out there. He shouted as a light began to fill Luffy's eyes in realization on what was happening. And I'll definitely create a map of the whole world and every island in. Nami declared, putting her own foot on top of the barrel, a large grin on her face, as Sanji nodded, no lust in his eyes, but admiration for her dream. I will become the greatest swordsman in this world, surpassing your uncle, Luffy. Zoro said next, placing his own foot onto it. Now Luffy stared at them along with Usopp, who looked at the three in shock because they were so sure of themselves and their dreams. Well, I will become a brave man like my father, a great warrior of the seas, supporting Luffy in becoming the Pirate King. He shouted, not really sure if that was the right thing to say, before he placed his own foot on the barrel and looked at the others, who nodded and smiled at him, accepting his dream wholeheartedly. You guys, Luffy started looking at them before grinning his special smile and placing his foot beside Zoro's, determination in his eyes as everyone watched him, a warm feeling spreading between them despite the cold rain and splashes from the roaring sea. I will become the king of the pirates and also make my family proud of me. Luffy shouted to them, their eyes watching one another. A strong bond had been formed and not even the trials of paradise could break them now. Let's go everyone, let's go home where adventure is calling us. Luffy shouted as they all lifted the foot they had on the barrel in the air and brought it down with enough force to smash the barrel, their dream secured and acknowledged, so now nothing could stand in their way. Luffy was so caught up in the vows that were just made, he almost missed a familiar call on the wind that would normally be missed because of the heavy rain on the waters and ship. His eyes widening at the memory of Reverse Mountain, he didn't even stop to tell the others what was happening before he raced inside and began to push the helm away from the current they were about to get on. Luffy, what are you doing? Nami shrieked as the ship began to turn away from Reverse Mountain. We can't go this way, Luffy said through gritted teeth, because pushing through the strong current wasn't easy even if he was strong. But this is the only way into the Grand Line. I thought you wanted to go there. Usopp had come in to see what was going on and why the ship was rocking more than it should. My hands are a little wet from the rain, I need help. He asked as Zoro pushed them all out of the way and took the other side of Luffy to turn and steer the ship away from the lighthouse. What now, Luffy? If you won't go over Reverse Mountain, then how are we getting into paradise? Sanji asked, looking at the two who were pushing and pulling the helm together. There's another way, but we can't go down the mountain, something's blocking the path. He said, finally bringing his crew up to speed on his random action. So where is the other way in then? Nami asked, placing a hand on her hip. Through the calm Thingy, Luffy said as Nami's eyes widened in surprise. But that's where, Luffy, you idiot. She shouted, bringing her fist down on his head, which in turn caused him to grab the helm, too tightly snapping it in two. A few mouths dropped at the sudden action as Zoro closed his eyes, calming his nerves. What the hell, Luffy? Usopp shouted, looking at the broken helm. It wasn't my fault. He glared at Nami, who was crossing her arms, a tick on her forehead at his silent accusations. What's so bad that you had to change our direction, Luffy? Zoro asked him, because even he was a little startled by Luffy's sudden change of direction. It's nothing bad, it's just nothing really good either, sorta, I guess. He tried to think of how to explain the giant whale waiting on the other side of the mountain. What a fantastic explanation, Luffy, Nami said, still crossing her arms in annoyance. The calm place does mean we need to row a bit, but it's a good place for us to get stronger. Luffy said happily, the rain on the roof calming him down now. This calm place is known as the Calm Belt. Nami said as everyone looked to her for a better explanation on where they were headed to. In the Calm Belt there is no wind at all, so ships that fall in there tend to never leave. Also, it's known as the Sea King's Nest. She said as their eyes turned back towards a laughing Luffy, who had already experienced the Calm Belt many times. But you guys are strong, so there's nothing to worry about. Luffy said casually, causing Usopp to blush and Sanji to smirk, taking a breath of his smoke. So it's filled with many different types of Sea King? Sanji asked Luffy, who nodded in excitement. I've tried many of them when training with my grandpa. He said as Sanji let the smoke out of his mouth. Then I am expecting some good dishes to come out of this place. He said, excitement replacing the slight fear he had of taking a different course. Luffy smiled, glad his crew was more open-minded now. And we can train a little against those giant fish. Zoro smirked as Luffy nodded as well. Ace, Sabo, and I once had a competition on who could beat the most. He remembered that day fondly. Did you win? Usopp asked Luffy knowing his brothers were a tough competition. Nah, Sabo won. Luffy admitted then laughed. Should we wait until the rain has stopped before setting sail that way? Usopp asked Nami who was looking out the window. That may be wise. We don't really want to wander into the calm belt during a storm, we'll get eaten for sure. She said, a slight frown on her face. That sounds kind of fun. Luffy chirped, causing Nami to yell at him to be quiet. Only you would think getting eaten by a fish was fun. Sanji said, shaking his head and making his way towards the kitchen side of the ship. If we're going to wait it out then I'll start on some food, it's been a while since any of us have eaten. Sanji said as Nami nodded and shivered. I'm going to take a bath, the rain really chilled me. Sanji's eyes welled with hearts at those words, but the demands for food from Luffy and Usopp stopped him from taking any other action. The storm should let up in about an hour and a half. She said, looking once more out the window, her eyes naturally taking in the weather and its behaviors carefully. That means food, and then we go? Luffy asked as Nami nodded. Eat something then we'll start on our way, we also don't want to get trapped in the calm belt at night, Luffy. She said softly to him, knowing how much he wanted to go, but it was her job to ensure the safety of the crew through navigating. Amen. He said before pounding on the table demanding food to be made quicker. Alright, I'm on it, shitty rubber bastard. Sanji said, but there was no anger in his voice. While Sanji was working on a small snack and Nami taking her bath, Luffy, Usopp and Zoro played a game of cards around the table, laughing lightly, enjoying the moment of calm. So, what is the reason you don't want to go over the mountain, Luffy? Zoro asked him as Usopp looked towards him, wanting the answer as well. There's a giant whale on the other side that likes to block off the way down. I didn't know if he'd be right there or not, but still, they had just gotten the going merry and Luffy really didn't want it broken yet. You were worried the ship would crash into the whale? Zoro asked, and Luffy nodded. Yeah, that would really break the… Usopp's face paled as he turned to look at the broken helm before jumping up in mock surprise. The helm? Looking at Zoro and Luffy, Usopp growled at them before stomping off to find things needed to fix it so they could carry on safely. What's his problem? Luffy asked, pouting that their game had just been ruined. Who knows? Zoro said as Nami came back, a towel wrapped around her head, drying her hair, and Sanji finished the snack, placing it down on the table, smiling at Nami the whole time. Nami looked at Usopp, who was a little bit away fixing the helm, before turning her eyes back to the two responsible for the problem. Are you guys going to help him out at all? She asked, but Usopp began to wave a hand at her. I've got it, Nami, Mary is my comrade to fix, so just eat some and we'll be on our way shorty. He said, but didn't look at them as he continued to fix the helm. Thanks, Sanji. She smiled, taking a little plate full and joining the boys at the table. Of course, my lovely Nami Swan. So we're avoiding a giant whale? Zoro pushed Luffy back onto the conversation they were having. His name's Laboon, or at least I think that's his name, the weird guy who stays at the lighthouse takes care of him. There's also a chance my family might be waiting there for me as well if Sabo could get to that place quick enough. I don't doubt that they can as well. Luffy knew going through the calm place was a good idea, but at the same time it was the harder route to take. Either way we should be ready to go soon, right, Usopp? Nami asked the sniper, who was wiping sweat off of his forehead and smiling. It's not the greatest job, but it will get us to where we need to go. He said as Luffy cheered in happiness and Nami moved towards the window, a small smile on her own face as she touched a log pose on her wrist. The sun is still pretty high in the sky, we should go before it gets dark. She said, opening the door, letting the wind blow the scent of fresh rain and ocean drifting through. Enjoy the breeze, it'll be gone soon. Luffy said in a silly tone before running to his figurehead, letting Nami take control of the course of the ship. Thanks for the reminder, Luffy. She said, shaking her head, but a smile on her face. Zoro moved to a spot by some tangerine trees to flop down and take a nap. Boy, aren't you getting wet that way? Usopp asked the swordsman, who was snoring already. Ignore him, if that shithead gets sick it's his own fault. Sanji said, lighting up a new smoke. They sailed for a while. The closer they got to the calm belt, the slower it felt they were moving. Can't we go any faster? Usopp asked, leaning over the railing, boredom kicking in now. You knew this would happen, the less wind there is the slower the ship goes. Nami said, her voice barely hiding her annoyance at the boys. Maybe we should start rowing? Usopp asked her, then ignoring the temper in her voice. Sighing, she called on Luffy and Zoro to help Usopp get the paddles out as she went to find Sanji. Are we there yet? Zoro asked, yawning as Luffy joined them, yawning as well. The wind's almost gone, he said, looking up at the clouds as a smile began to spread across his face. Boy, Luffy, what's with that look of yours? Sanji had come out of the kitchen with Nami beside him, only to see Luffy standing there, a wide smile on his face. That. he said, simply pointing his finger to the water as they walked closer, curious as to what would make Luffy look that excited. As they got closer, the water began to bubble at the surface as a giant sea king rose from the ocean, staring down at them curiously. Oh no. Nami said, a look of dread crossing over her face as Usopp dropped the paddles on the deck, seeing the sea king looking down at him as another moved in beside it, looking weirder than the first one. "You've got to be kidding me," Usopp said, but Luffy laughed as Zoro smirked, looking up at them, touching his new blades in anticipation. "Boy Luffy, you said you didn't win against your brothers the last time you were here," Zoro said as Luffy turned his head around to look at the swordsman. Man, me and Ace were having trouble keeping score as Sabo just beat them all up," he said, remembering the day. "Why don't we have a match just like that one?" Zoro suggested as a light filled Luffy's eyes at the idea. "Sure, but I won't get caught up in numbers this time," he challenged as Zoro pulled out his blade. More sea kings were beginning to surround the ship. "Nami, is this normal?" Usopp asked her, his knees shaking at the sight. "Welcome to the calm belt," she said softly, fear also chilling her bones. "Boy, mind if I join in on this little game of yours?" Sanji asked as Luffy smiled wider, Zoro touching his blades, the feeling of anticipation stinging his fingertips. "What do we get if we win?" Zoro asked, wanting to know if there was a prize involved in this. When Sabo, Ace, and I played, the winner got a night off from training, but Luffy tried to think, but it wasn't really working for him. "I have 3 bottles of strong booze. If you win you can have them, not like you'd ever win, but there's a prize for you," Sanji said as Zoro glared at him annoyed. "And Luffy, if you win I'll make tonight's meal with the most meat possible," Sanji said to Luffy, who now was going to go out of his way to win this for sure. "And you should cook?" Zoro asked, crossing his arms and glaring at the man. "I'd like a bath with the beautiful Dottie," began only to get a punch on the head. "Never." Nami yelled at him as he fell to the ground, heart still filling his eyes. "Well, we can figure that out once I win," Luffy said to Zoro, who caught the word he used and smirked at his friend. "You mean when I win?" Not waiting for a reply, Zoro jumped from the Mary onto the nose of a sea king, smiled at it, then slowly brought out his blade, slicing it, sending it down to the water below. Landing on the body of the fish, Zoro turned and smirked at Luffy, saying a simple word enough to bring out the competitive nature Luffy had inside of him. "One." "Damn it, just you wait." Luffy jumped off the ship onto a head of one, punching it in the face, sending it flying backwards into the water, but Zoro was already onto the next one. Sanji had joined in as well, kicking the faces and fins of every sea king that crossed his path. "Look at them go," Usopp said, not wanting to join in on the battle game, but just to enjoy the competition going on. "If only those two could get along like this all the time," she said, nodding towards Zoro and Sanji, who were both smiling for once, not angry at one another. "That would be nice," Usopp agreed, having realized that Zoro and Sanji were an unbeatable team if they could get along long enough to work well together. "Boy Luffy, what's your number?" Zoro called over to the kid who had just knocked out another one. 17, you? He called over as Zoro sliced one down, landing on its floating fin. 23. He smirked, turning his eyes towards the cook, who glared at the two of them. "You both started before me," he yelled, pointing at them, but Zoro shook his head. "Always making excuses, Swirls." He then jumped onto the next victim, but Luffy frowned. "I wish I could move a little bit faster." He knew he was in no danger, not from any of these sea kings. "Luffy, if you just stand there you won't win for sure," Sanji yelled down to him, but Luffy was trying to figure something out. Before he left to start his journey, Luffy and Thatch fought often to build up his stamina and train him as hard as possible. Every once in a while Luffy was able to make his blood move faster and his body feel light enough he could almost fly. He had been training real hard, but something always didn't click all the way, not letting him get that weird feeling too often. "Luffy, are you alright?" Nami called up to him as he turned back to look at her. "I'm trying to make myself move faster," he admitted to his navigator, who frowned. "Their body is rubber, right?" she asked, looking him over as he nodded, but he really wanted to get back to playing with his friends. "I wish I knew more how to help you, Luffy." While Nami was the best doctor they had on their ship at the moment, there was only so much even she could do. "No problem, thanks for listening, Nami," he said before jumping off to keep fighting. "You're welcome," she said, shaking her head at him since it was now he who had some catching up to do. "Luffy, if you stop like that you'll never win," Zoro said to him, but stopped when he saw Luffy take out 2 sea kings at the same time. "You were saying?" he asked Zoro, who didn't even wait, jumping to the next one. "Boy Moss Head, that one was mine," Sanji yelled at Zoro, who just stared at the love cook with a dull expression on his face. "Be faster next time then," he said, but Sanji wasn't going to have any of that crap. "I was standing on him, that should have been obvious that I was going to take him out." They began to argue, their voices growing louder each moment. "Geez, why are you guys so angry?" Luffy giggled, taking out another one that had come his way easily. Looking towards them to brag about his next takedown, his eyes widened as a sea king had come up beside them, its mouth open wide ready to bite them and swallow them down. Sanji, Zoro. Luffy shouted, but they continued to argue, not even bothering to look at the approaching dangerous sea king. Damn it. Luffy swore under his breath. He landed on one of the dead sea king's body. It was that moment his legs felt funny, so his eyes darted down, watching them make a weird movement before a slight steam swirled around him and his body felt that light weight he had been craving. Pushing off on his feet, Luffy felt as if he could actually fly. He wanted to laugh, but the thought his nakama could be in danger stopped him from doing so. Luffy was faster now than he had ever been. Catching up on the Sea King was easy, but not necessary, as Sanji and Zoro both turned to look at the Sea King, a glare on both of their faces. "Don't interfere," they shouted, hitting the fish, knocking it out, then turning their attention back towards each other. "That was mine," Zoro said, crossing his arms as Sanji scowled. "You mean mine?" he argued back, but Luffy was now moving really fast with no target to attack. "Guys, watch out, I'm coming in fast," he shouted, but it was too late, seeing how Luffy was now crashing into the two people and falling into the sea below them. "Save me, I can't swim," he reminded them as Zoro nodded quickly, not about to let Luffy drown. Once they hit the water, Zoro grabbed Luffy, who had his mouth hanging open, his eyes swirling from having no strength in his body to even save himself. "Thank you, Zoro." Luffy was able to get out as the two swam back to the ship, Luffy thrown over Zoro's shoulder safely. "Are you guys alright?" Usopp came running over, giving Sanji his hand to help him on the ship. "Yeah, but I've had enough playing in the water." Sanji's smokes had gotten wet as well as his lighter, so it would be a little while before he could have a new one. "The Sea Kings are disappearing," Usopp said, looking as they all began to drift back into the water, no longer caring about the little ship. "Of course they are, we're out of the calm belt. Those waves you guys were causing helped us sail, so thanks for that," Nami said, bringing a few towels out for them as Luffy was coming back to himself little by little. "What was that, Luffy?" Zoro asked his friend once the cook had gone back inside and the others went off on their own. "What was what?" Luffy asked, taking the towel and drying off his black hair, making it messier than it normally was. "You moved faster than normal." Luffy was already pretty fast, so for him to almost disappear from Zoro's eyes was something the swordsman didn't miss. "I dunno, I've been trying to work on that for a while now, I guess. Sometimes I'm able to push my body just a little further to a point it almost feels like I can fly. Does that sound crazy?" Luffy asked him, but Zoro shook his head. "It's almost like you're pushing your body to the next level, almost as if unlocking a gear of some sort." Zoro was staring at Luffy, trying to figure out just how he was able to do that. "A gear, huh?" He thought about it, but his stomach was starting to demand attention. "That sounded louder than normal," Zoro said, sweat dropping at the growl the teenager's stomach had made. "So far, whenever I can move like that I always get really hungry afterwards." Luffy shrugged, grabbing his stomach and standing up. "Sounds like a normal fight to me." Zoro was used to Luffy's eating habits by now, so the boy saying he was hungry was nothing new. Luffy was about to run into the kitchen to grab the food he could so clearly smell, but something stopped him, which in turn stopped Zoro as well. "Luffy?" he asked, looking at the boy who was staring across the water, the wind blowing his hair slightly, the straw hat hanging down his back. "We're home," he said, a small smile on his face, a smile Zoro had never seen before. This smile was softer, but held a lot of emotions in it, but was very different than Luffy's normal wide laughing smile. "Come on, let's grab food and we can set the course from there." Zoro had to push Luffy through the door to the galley, surprising everyone. "We're home," he repeated as a warm atmosphere filled the room. "So where now, Captain?" Nami asked, closing a book she had been reading. "Towards the mountain, there's a friend there I want to meet," he said as a few of them looked at Luffy in curiosity. "A friend?" Usopp asked as Luffy nodded excitedly. "Yeah, his name is Crocus, he guards the lighthouse, but he's taking care of a whale I want to see," Luffy said as Nami nodded, just accepting that their course was towards the mountain. "If you wanted to see the whale, why didn't we just go down the mountain in the first place?" Sanji asked. He was a little cranky because his cigarettes were still wet and couldn't be smoked. "Because this way was easier for us and I had fun." Zoro smiled at Luffy, who laughed his special laugh. "But who won?" Usopp asked. The three who played in the game all looked at each other and smiled a little. "Who cares?" Sanji said, first putting another platter on the table of fresh Sea King. Man, I just had a lot of fun." Luffy's arm stretched to the middle of the table and grabbed a handful of food. "Next time we'll make sure we keep proper count," Zoro said, closing his eyes as Luffy laughed at him. "Yeah, we suck at that." The fresh meat was the most amazing any of the crew except for Luffy had ever eaten. Because they were from the East Blue, it was rare a Sea King would come and stay in the calm waters, let alone a fisherman could be strong enough to take it down to sell its meat at the market. "I wonder what else I can cook with this." Sanji asked himself, walking to the kitchen, pulling out a notebook and a pencil to try and work on some new recipes for the crew. I'm going to map out the calm belt a little. Nami stood up, leaving the galley to mark down all she had seen and journal their day. I broke Nami's weapon back on her home island, so I'm going to go and see what I can make for her so she doesn't charge me for a new one. Usopp waved his farewell and moved to his own part of the ship to find silence for a while. Zoro and Luffy were the only two left with nothing to do, so they looked at one another and smiled, no words needing to be said. They walked to the deck and just flopped down, closing their eyes. In between them was Luffy's straw hat and Zoro's 3 swords, the wind blowing coolly over them as the sun was beginning to set. The day was fun. Luffy said through the silence. Zoro had his eyes closed but was listening all the same. Tomorrow will be even more fun, I just know it. He smiled wider as Zoro nodded lightly, the sound of a whale's calls on the wind beckoning them forward. Tomorrow we start our adventure for sure. So this giant whale won't actually eat us, will it? Usopp asked, looking towards Luffy, who laughed loudly at the idea. That would be fun, but I don't actually think he will. Luffy smiled, wanting to meet his old friend again quickly. But why is this whale so important that we need to go out of our way? Nami asked, checking the log pose on her wrist. As I have something I need to do first, and you need instructions on how to use that thingy, I think. Luffy said, pointing at the object she was checking carefully. I can figure it out myself. She said offhandedly, not really thinking that it would be that hard to work out. And I think you could as well, but isn't it good to talk to someone who can help? Luffy asked her as they all looked his way. And the whale will help Nami how? Usopp asked, confused. Are you an idiot? The whale won't help her, but Crocus will. Luffy said, causing Zoro to smirk and Sanji to shake his head, but smiling slightly all the same. So this Crocus guy, is he strong? Zoro asked, looking up from his slight nap as Luffy smiled a little more. Apparently he was on Gold Roger's crew, or that's what Pops told me once. Luffy said as Zoro nodded, going back to sleep easily. Was he the navigator then? Nami asked, but Luffy had wandered away, tired of talking about what they were going to see, especially since they were almost there. Luffy? Nami sighed, but smiled softly, knowing his attention could only be held for so long. Even if he can be a pain, I'd have him no other way. Usopp smiled, glad Luffy was who he was, no matter the problems that came with him. Oi, you guys. I think I see him. Luffy called to everyone, letting them know that he had seen the giant nose of Laboon in the distance. That's once big whale, how old must he be to get this big? Usopp asked, looking at the giant figure as they got closer. Oi. Laboon, it's me. Luffy jumped around the deck, waving his arms like a maniac, trying his hardest to catch the attention of the whale. Luffy, he probably can't hear you. Sanji said, bringing Nami a small drink which she gratefully took. Oi. He continued to shout, ignoring him as they grew closer and closer. Just as Zoro was about to step in and calm Luffy down some, the whale turned his head around and stared down at the small ship and the crewmates. What's wrong, buddy? Are you sick or something? Luffy asked, since Laboon hadn't really shown any recognition towards Luffy in any way. Maybe he doesn't remember you, Nami said, a little bit of fear in her voice, but Luffy pointed to something painted on the whale's nose. That's Nami said, but Luffy shook his head. That's Pop's mark, I put it there when I came back to paradise a few years ago so he wouldn't hurt himself anymore. I need to change it to our mark now so he can't forget me, not ever. Luffy said, crossing his arms and calling his friend again, but Laboon still hadn't made any signs of remembering him. Luffy, are you sure this is a good idea? Nami asked. The shake in her voice had intensified as Laboon dipped his head down into the water and opened his mouth. Nope, I think this is going to be a really bad idea actually. He cried out as Laboon began to suck them in, but before they entered the whale's mouth, Laboon's lips closed down, blocking their way as waves crashed and shook the area around. What the hell is wrong with this whale of yours, Luffy? Zoro yelled through the waves as he held on tightly, hoping not to be thrown overboard. Oh no, this hasn't ever happened before. He was surprised as well, wondering what the heck was happening to his old friend. Just as Luffy opened his mouth to call out to Laboon, the whale shot a stream of water out of the top of his head, sending seawater everywhere, along with 2 weird people. Is everything alright now? Nami asked, though she was taking some deep breaths. Seems to be for now, Usopp sighed, still holding on to the mast, waiting for it to happen all over again. Boy, Laboon. You almost ate us. Luffy yelled and stomped his foot, trying to show just how annoyed he really was that he nearly got eaten by the whale. But he didn't eat you, you and your crew would probably give him indigestion anyways. A voice called to them as Luffy smiled, forgetting his anger quickly and looking around for Crocus. Would he do that? Luffy yelled, still looking around for his friend. Because of them. At those words you could almost see the question mark above Luffy's head in confusion. Because of who now? He looked around as two people came crashing into the deck of the Mary, making Usopp take a few steps back and Zoro to pull out one of his blades, his eyes watching Luffy for instruction. What happened? One of them said, pulling himself together. He was a weird man wearing a crown on his head, but it was the girl beside him with the pale blue hair that really caught Luffy's attention. He began in surprise, but closed his lips tight as she glared deeply at him, recognition blazing in her own hazel eyes. "Who the heck are you people?" The crown-wearing one shouted, standing up quickly and pointing to them, but no one moved to answer him. Zoro's eyes were still on Luffy in question, since he didn't miss how Luffy and the girl connected slightly. "That's our line," Usopp shouted, pointing his own finger at them. "We are agents of the infamous Baroque works. You should fear us pirates," the man said as the girl stood up beside him, hands on her hips, but her brow twitched ever so slightly, causing Luffy to laugh. "Right, so what did you guys want with Laboon?" He pointed to the giant whale who was eyeing them still. "He's large enough to make a decent meal for our agents, don't you think, Miss Wednesday?" The man's familiarity towards Vivi really confused Luffy, so instead of saying something he just chose to walk away and visit his old friend. "You almost ate us," he yelled as Laboon called loudly to him, causing Luffy to shake his head in annoyance. "You can't just eat my crew, you know we have an adventure to go on still, and Ma hasn't met my crew yet, so don't do that again." Laboon dropped his face down closer to Luffy, the sign of the WhiteBeard pirates painted crudely on his nose. "Why don't we give you a bath and put the real mark on your face, okay?" Luffy patted Laboon's nose as the whale loudly agreed with him. Vivi, taking in that her partner was busy arguing with a long-nosed crew member, jumped away from the ship and moved carefully towards Luffy. "You don't need to sneak up on me like that, just say hi, princess." Luffy turned away from Laboon, his eyes on the weirdly dressed Vivi, who had her hand on her hip, smirking towards Luffy, who was frowning at her. "What's a WhiteBeard pirate doing so far from home? Don't your brothers hate it when you go so far away?" she asked in a tone Luffy hadn't heard from her before. "I'm my own captain now, Ace and Sabo have their own adventures to take," he said simply before eyeing her once again. "You and Nami might get along." He turned away from her, walking towards the lighthouse where Crocus was relaxing in a lawn chair watching them but not making any movements to interfere. "Oh, and why's that?" she asked as Luffy stopped and looked over his shoulder, not smiling. "Because you both chose to lie to protect something you love when all you need to do is ask for help. You act like you understand anything when you've lived an easy life, Luffy," she said softly to him, and behind her anger he heard sadness. "Maybe that's why I can understand, because I'd do the same thing." She shook her head at him. "It's not so easy to ask for help, you know." She almost shouted at him, losing herself to her emotions. "But it's not exactly that hard either, we're Nakama, remember?" Vivi stood stunned at his tone and its finality. He truly believed she was his Nakama because of a promise they had made years before. "When you're done being stupid, I could really use some help with Laboon." With that he stomped away to deal with getting the proper paint and soapy water for his new mark. "Nakama, huh?" Luffy, age 12. "I hate this island already." Luffy crossed his arms and pouted, which was very unusual for him in the eyes of his family. "Don't you want adventure?" Thatch asked, throwing his arm around the little preteen who was going through yet another mood swing. "Yeah, but this place is too hot and the Marines have been following us for a while now, don't think I haven't heard you guys talking about them," Luffy said to Thatch, who looked to Marco for help since dealing with a moody Luffy wasn't very fun for anyone. "Luffy, this place is a little warm, but we won't be staying long, yoi. Pops has heard some rumors about a stupid crocodile in the area and wants to make sure this place is safe. He is on good terms with the king of this country," Marco said to the boy, who just sighed and walked away, still a little cranky. "Maybe Ace and Sabo can cheer him up some," Thatch said, dragging Marco to the galley for a drink he looked like he was in need of. "What's wrong with you this time, Luffy?" Sabo asked, flipping the page of the latest book he was reading. "This island's too hot," he complained, sitting down beside his blonde brother, who nodded slightly but continued to read his page. "And this has stopped you from an adventure before?" Ace asked, coming up beside Luffy and sitting down next to him on the deck. "Nothing can stop me from an adventure," he shouted at Ace, who tilted his head, giving Luffy a look. "Then why are you complaining?" Ace asked as Luffy pouted some more, not really sure himself why he felt like complaining. "He just did. Because I want to. You never know, Lou, you might make a new friend on this island," Sabo said, closing his book, putting a bookmark in between the pages he was on, knowing that with Luffy and Ace beside him, he wasn't going to be able to continue reading quietly. "The new Nakama?" he asked, but Ace shook his head, laughing. "Not everyone you meet is meant to be a Nakama, Luffy," Ace said, laughter still coming from him. "Why not?" He was genuinely puzzled on why the friends he meets weren't allowed to be considered Nakama. "Because Nakama is like family and some people are just meant to stay friends," Ace tried to clarify, but the gears just weren't turning in Luffy's mind. "So how will I know which people are Nakama and what ones aren't?" Luffy's forehead was starting to turn red with the amount of thought process this was actually taking him. You'll know by right here. Sabo knelt down in front of Luffy and poked his chest where his heart beat. But how will my heart know? Luffy asked, eyes wide, now his hand touching the spot Sabo had poked. It just will, little brother. Ace smirked, standing up as Luffy looked at them in awe, which they had to admit was pretty amazing. So it's a mystery feeling, right? Yeah, Lou, that sounds about right. Sabo chuckled as the navigation called out the port that we're going to be landing at shortly. So shall we go and explore the island? Ace asked Luffy, who nodded before bringing back the small pout. It's way too hot here though. I find it not hot enough. Ace replied with a smirk. And I think you're both idiots. Sabo said with a small smile before pushing them forwards. Let's go find Marco and the others so we can start exploring already. X. So can we go home now? Luffy asked after finishing his meal, startling Marco, who had gone with him for lunch while the others explored. Luffy, what's wrong, Yoi? The way he had been acting lately had really bothered him, and now it was starting to ring warning bells in the older man's mind. Something feels off here, like I dunno, doesn't feel right. He really couldn't explain it, but this country, this island had a dark feel to it he didn't really like. We need to stay for the night, Lou, then we'll head back to the sea, I promise, Yoi. Whatever was bothering Luffy, Marco was going to let the old man know just in case. Amen. Luffy stuffed another pile of meat in his mouth before something caught his eyes outside the window. If I have to stay, can I go wander around? Luffy still didn't feel right, but something in his gut was telling him to follow that person. I thought you wanted to go home, Yoi. Marco's brow rose a little higher than it already was as Luffy began to squirm in his chair, his eyes darting back out the window a few times more. I do, but I want to go look around, maybe I can learn to like this place a bit more if I get to know it right. He pleaded as Marco waved an arm, letting Luffy know he was free to go as the boy jumped from his seat and bolted out the door. What's his hurry, Yoi? Marco stood up and looked out the window, trying to see from Luffy's point of view what could be so interesting, but all he saw was a bustling town of peddlers and salespeople mixed in with civilians. I'll follow him just in case, Yoi. Placing a handful of money on the table, Marco left the restaurant to follow his precious little brother. Luffy had been following the girl, who was watching carefully at every turn she made. Something about her was different, and that made him want to be friends with her. Also, she might be able to explain why the country felt so weird. Boy, Luffy, what are you doing? Luffy cringed slightly as Ace called his name, waving at him, trying to get his attention. I'm busy, go away. He said, not wanting Ace to spoil his fun, because as much as he loved his big brother, Luffy wanted his own friend sometimes. That's no way to talk to our older brother now, is it, Luffy? Ace asked before giving Luffy a punch on the head, knowing it wouldn't hurt the boy, but more annoy him than anything. I'm busy making friends. He told Ace after he rubbed the bump on his head and looking around. I don't see anyone, Lou. Ace was puzzled because he knew the kid couldn't lie to save his life, so. Damn it. The girl had vanished, so he gave one last tongue out at Ace before running off to find her again. That was interesting, Thatch said, now standing beside Ace, a hand on his hip, and watched as Luffy ran around the corner, eyes darting everywhere. What was interesting, Yoi? Marco ran towards them, looking at Ace, who had his arms crossed over his bare chest, the t-shirt he was wearing open for the entire world to see. Luffy's acting weird. He said simply, and Marco nodded in understanding. Then what are we waiting for? Let's spy on our little brother. Thatch gave a playful smirk at those words as the two looked at him. Sabo had left the group a while ago to find a good place to finish his reading, since it seemed that Ace and the others were about to become more troublesome than he really wanted. Luffy had searched for a while before finding the girl, so he followed her closely. As much as he wanted to say hi, an old memory from being rejected stopped him, since he didn't really want that feeling again. He was so deep in his thoughts he almost jumped back when a pair of hazel eyes glared at him strongly. Why are you following me? She demanded, pushing a strand of light blue behind her ear since it had escaped her ponytail. I'm not. He said dumbly before mentally kicking himself at the response. So what are you doing then? She demanded, putting her hands on her hips and frowning. Watching you? The look on her face at those words made him laugh. You're funny and interesting, let's be friends. He said, but she crossed her arms. Why should I be friends with a creeper like you? Luffy frowned a little, he has never have been called that before. Because I'm funny and interesting, I think. Ace says I'm interesting, especially when I eat more than him, and Sabo and Ma laugh at me a lot, so I have to be funny. Luffy began to ramble on about all the reasons why she should be friends with him before he stopped due to her laughter. You're right about one thing, you are pretty funny. She said, letting him walk with her now. So where are we going? Luffy asked, swinging his arms back and forth, now glad he didn't have to follow silently behind her anymore. My secret base, there are other kids there as well, but I'm the leader. She said, proudly crossing her arms. Really? So you must be strong, right? Luffy was surprised this girl didn't look all that strong. Sometimes strength doesn't come from your muscles, but from your mind. She hadn't asked his name, which he realized as she trailed off her sentence. Luffy, my name's Luffy. Man, I'm Vivi. She put her hand out and he took it, knowing that it was polite to do so, or at least Sabo said it was. How far is the secret base? Luffy asked her once they started to move again, since it was hot out and he didn't really like hot. Not far. Did you know you smell funny? She asked, wrinkling her nose towards him as he lifted his arm to smell, then shrugged. I don't stink that bad. He had never been told that before, but she shook her head. Not that type of bad, just like burning rubber or something, she said as he laughed loudly at those words. I'm made of rubber. He said in a cheerful voice, hiding the worry behind telling her about his fruit powers. Rubber, huh? You must have eaten a devil fruit. He nodded, glad she understood and didn't seem scared. Yup, I ate the Gomu Gomu no Mi. He said proudly as she nodded in understanding. One of our guards ate a devil fruit that turns him into a bird of some kind. She wanted to talk to Pell now and find out what his fruit power was really like as Luffy's face lit up. My brother Marco ate a bird one too. He turns into a mystery fire bird that's super pretty when he goes all blue. The image Vivi got was strange, but she smiled and nodded at the older boy anyway. So why are we stopping a lot? Luffy looked around. His older brothers ducked behind a wall before he could see them. Because I kind of left home without permission. She said, looking around once again. Where's home? He asked her, curious, because she didn't look like a normal civilian to him with the fresh clothes she was wearing and the fact that she smelled like perfume. Promise not to freak out? She asked him as he nodded. Promise. I'm from the castle, my dad's the king. She said, looking down, but not because she was ashamed of being a princess, because she loved that. It was just many reacted differently towards her once they knew who she was. Cool, my pops is talking to your dad. He said, putting his hands behind his head and walking a little bit forward. You're not going to treat me different? She asked him in surprise as he gave her a funny look. Would you treat me different if you know that I was a pirate? He asked her, that weird look still on his face. A pirate, she said, and looked him over. He didn't seem dangerous and had been kind so far and really open to her. Nope. She said, knowing it was the truth. Then I won't treat you different, we're friends now, right? Luffy reached his hand towards her the way Pops did when welcoming a new member to the family. He was welcoming her to his own little one. Right. She smiled at him, taking the hand leading him towards the base. Calm down, Marco, we need more information to go from than just him taking her hand, Thatch said, holding the phoenix back, but the blue flames were dancing in his eyes. And he was stalking her, Ace pointed in, ignoring the dangerous look Thatch was giving him at those words. He was trying to make a new friend. We won't know anything else until we follow him. I think you missed your chance there. Ace pointed out as Thatch turned to look where Luffy and the girl had been moments before. It seems they have wandered off. He sweat dropped at how fast a pair of children could escape two division commanders' vision so easily. We should search the entire town until they're found, Yoi. Marco said, crossing his arms, a frown on his lazy face. Marco buddy, I know Luffy means a lot to you, but you know maybe it's time to let your little brother grow up. Thatch said as Ace waved goodbye, not wanting to stick around since he could question Luffy later on if he needed to. And what's that supposed to mean, Yoi? Marco asked, following beside Thatch, who grinned a little weirdly for Marco's liking. You know what I mean, Marco, she's a girl, he's a boy. Do I really need to have this conversation with you? I thought you were at least older than I am. Thatch joked, earning a shoulder bump from Marco in response to the teasing. I doubt Luffy will have any of those sick thoughts going through your head, Yoi. Marco scoffed, causing his best friend to laugh more. We'll ask him tonight, so be patient, Marco. When Luffy waved goodbye to Vivi at the gates to the palace, he honestly felt so much better about this island than he had when they first arrived, although that strange feeling of unease was still there. It wasn't as strong as before. Luffy, where were you? Ace walked up to Luffy with Sabo beside him, not really liking that Luffy had been out so late. The sun was just setting and shops were beginning to put their house lights on. I was he began, but he had promised Vivi earlier that he wouldn't tell anyone about where the Sunasuna clan was or who was a part of it. I was just wandering around, no big deal. He hadn't really lied because he did wander around, just he wandered around with a few people making friends with the clan. So you were alone then, Yoi? Marco asked, coming up beside Ace, who nodded at Marco's words. No, I made some friends which I'll be hanging out with tomorrow. Luffy was glad he could tell Marco about this now, so he didn't have to wait for permission later. And just where will you be hanging out, Yoi? Marco asked him, hand on his hip, brow raised up high, his eyes suspicious, which startled Luffy a bit, but he didn't really let it bother him too much. It's a secret, she told me not to tell you. Luffy responded before walking away, the smell of a late supper calling his name. A secret meeting with a girl, huh? Thatch was leaning over the railing of the ship, smirking down at the three who were frowning. You hear that, Pops? It looks like our little Luffy's going on a date. Thatch, you're blowing this all out of proportion. Aizu frowned at Thatch as Pop smiled softly at his children. Think about it, Aizu, wouldn't you like to dress Luffy up for this important moment in his life? Thatch asked as Aizu's eyes widened slightly, a thoughtful look on his face now before he turned going back to his room to plan out an outfit for Luffy to wear. Marco had turned a wonderful pale color that almost resembled snow at the thought of his little Luffy with a girl all alone. I think you're all being stupid. Sabo said, walking past them to go find Luffy and leave his delusional brothers to Thatch's mind games. When Sabo found Luffy, he was munching on a few plates of dinner that the cooks had saved for him. Thatch thinks you're going on a date. Sabo didn't quite know if Luffy even knew what that meant and wasn't surprised at the look of pure confusion on the boy's face. Date? You know, like taking someone out and being all sweet and well stupid. Sabo said, not really knowing if he wanted to start that conversation with Luffy before the boy laughed loudly. That's not what we're doing at all. Vivi and I are planning an attack on the rival base that wants to take over our clan's territory. I'm going to help her win, but I wasn't supposed to tell you that, so forget it. He said, giving his wide smile as Sabo smiled, shaking his head at Luffy's personality. So you don't think of this girl in some weird romantic way? He asked, knowing the answer before Luffy even spoke. Of course not, Vivi's like my sister and I think I might make her one of my nakama. Luffy said as Sabo took a seat and began to pick a few pieces off of his plate. Your ma will be glad to hear that. You guys are funny. Luffy laughed once more as Sabo laughed with him, agreeing. We're one funny family. When morning came, Luffy got up early and darted from the ship towards the meeting place him and Vivi promised to meet at as soon as possible. You took a while. She complained as Luffy looked around him once more, confusing her. My brothers think we're on a date and tried to strangle me into fancy stupid clothes. He admitted to her as her cheeks tinted before stomping her foot. We don't have time for stupid things like that. We have a secret base to defend. She yelled as Luffy nodded, glad she understood him. Agreed, so what are we waiting for? X. You're having fun with this, aren't you? Sabo asked Thatch, leaning up against the railing with him as the man smiled. Of course, it's not every day I can use this excuse to tease Marco and Ace. He said to the blonde who just stared at him. You know Luffy doesn't feel anything romantic towards this girl, right? Sabo asked, and Thatch nodded, watching Ace and Marco follow Luffy from a safe distance. Yes, but a time may come when it finally happens, so I wanted them to get used to the idea, that's all. Thatch said. Pops was listening to them from a distance and wondered just what type of person could be strong enough to catch his youngest son's attention, or if it was even possible. There was a chance that Luffy's ambitions and dreams were much more powerful than his wishes for that style of relationship. You just want to bug Marco. Sabo said, standing up now and walking away, a small smile on his pale features. That little brother is just an added bonus to all of this. Did you sort things out in this country, Pops? Thatch asked his father, who frowned a little. I did as best as I could, but this country doesn't wish to be under my protection, therefore there is nothing more I can do to protect them. Thatch nodded at Pop's words, knowing that some countries just preferred to remain their own without outsiders' help. The people of the sand are proud, and that's not exactly a bad thing. Thatch thought out loud. But it may not always be the best thing. I hope for good things in this country. Pops enjoyed the company of the King Cobra, and for that he accepted the decision to remain free. You never know, it might just take the kind heart of a little boy to win this country over. Thatch said, his mind flashing to Luffy and the little girl he was playing with. You believe Luffy could be the one to protect this country? Pops asked, knowing something was going to happen. He had heard about Luffy's bad feelings and trusted in the boy's instincts more than anything. I think that Luffy having a connection to the country's princess could be beneficial later on should it need to be. For now, let them be children. Pops wanted Luffy to have as many experiences as possible so he could learn to shape his world in whatever way suited him best. I know, but you have to admit they are kind of cute together. Thatch had to get one more jab in before walking off, leaving a chuckling Pops behind him. X. When Marco and Ace found Luffy and Vivi, they were all bandaged up and grinning proudly. Luffy? Marco raced to the boy's side, checking him for injuries that weren't already being treated. What are you guys doing here? Luffy asked, surprised to see Marco and Ace. We were worried about you. Ace said, looking at the girl, seeing she too had some bandages on her. Why? Because Thatch thinks we're on a date. He asked, causing Marco to sigh sadly, looking at the little kid he loved dearly. So it was you guys who said such stupid things like that? Vivi asked, looking at them, her eyes sharp as Marco turned his own blue ones on her for the first time. Trust me, child, if I had my way this kid here would never set foot off the ship without me by his side, Yoi. Marco said to her, looking her over carefully. What were you guys doing that caused you both to get so beat up? Ace asked, worry in his voice, looking at the two of them before a wide smile spread across their faces. We just defended our turf, right Luffy? She asked as he nodded. Turf? Ace turned to Luffy who laughed his special laugh. You didn't know? Ace frowned at those words. I guess Sabo really did forget Shishishi. Did you? Defend your turf I mean Yoi? Marco asked standing up and pulling the boy up with him. Man they won't be bothering the clan ever again. Luffy said as Vivi nodded proud of Luffy and her friends. I see, and about that date stuff we said before Ace started wanting to clear that all up for his and Marco's sakes, but the two kids looked at one another before laughing. She's like a sister to me. A little sister so I can be a big brother this time. Luffy said having learned that Vivi was a year younger. Is that all Yoi? Marco asked in disbelief. That's okay right ma? He asked as Marco patted their heads. Vivi looked up in surprise at the kind look Marco was giving her compared to the cold calculating look before. Welcome to the family, Princess Yoi. He said letting them go as Ace closed his eyes smiling. We're a little bit crazy, but it seems like you'll fit in just fine. Luffy laughed at those words. I'm going to walk her home we're leaving soon aren't we? He asked as the two nodded waving as Luffy and Vivi walked towards the palace. Should we kill Thatch for playing with our minds like that? Ace asked as Marco sighed. No, we fell into his trap on our own. Honestly we should have just asked Luffy from the start instead of making up our own conclusions Yoi. Marco sighed once more. Then let this day be a lesson to us for now. Ace pushed Marco forward a little as they made their way back to the ship to mildly punish Thatch. So Vivi, why did you sneak away from your home? That had been bothering Luffy since he met her, so he wanted the answer before he left this afternoon. Because I'm the princess. She said simply, her hands behind her back, a small smile on her face. But shouldn't that mean you should stay in the palace? If I only stay in the palace how will I ever learn about my people? A ruler should know how their people live so they can treat them fairly and properly. Vivi was an honest person who cared about others greatly and that was something Luffy respected. Vivi. He stopped and stood in front of her, a look of seriousness on his face. Join my pirate crew and become one of my nakama. He said in a tone of voice that made the word sound like an order. I can't. She said stepping past him and looking up at the palace she lived in. Why not? He didn't like the word no very much. Because my people need me, their princess, here. But even if you're on the seas as a pirate we will still be friends right? She asked him looking back at him now. Just because you're not coming with me doesn't mean you're not my nakama. If you ever need help I'll help you. He said sticking out his pinky. I promise. It was such a childish gesture but she put her own pinky on his. Man. I always wanted an older brother. She laughed as he took a few steps back knowing it was time to go. I always wanted a younger sibling. When I'm older I'll meet you again so be a good princess. The two waved goodbye as Luffy ran towards the ship happy to have met a nakama even if she didn't want to come with him on his journey. Next time we meet I'll be a true pirate captain. X. Luffy just what is that? Zoro had jumped on shore to see what Luffy and the weird girl were up to. It's our pirate mark can't you tell he demanded to his first mate who sweat dropped at the running paint and lopsided look of the skull. If I turn my head like this then just maybe Zoro whispered to himself looking at it and liking it a little more as the minutes passed. Vivi watched the man before a little smile came to her face at the way Luffy interacted with him. You haven't changed a day. She whispered as her partner began to call her code name. You leaving woman? Zoro asked her as Luffy gave her a blank face. Luffy, you promised me a long time ago that if I ever needed you you'd be there. She said as Zoro turned to look at Luffy, a brow raised. I did. Am I still allowed to take you up on that offer? She asked him as he smirked. About time you asked. Luffy? Zoro asked still staring at the girl and not sure what promises she had between his captain and herself. I have a feeling I'm still not going to like your country though. He said pouting slightly remembering the weird feeling he had gotten the last time he was there. You Mr. Waistbelt, are you not the swordsman Rorano Zoro? She asked turning to look at him as well as Luffy surprised that someone knew him here in paradise. Yeah that's my name, how did you come by it? Because even he was confused by her knowing him. You were asked to join the agency Baroque Works, but you turned it down. This piece of information caught Luffy's attention. Just how much trouble did you get into while wandering the East Blue? Luffy asked crossing his arms as Zoro's brow twitched in annoyance. Probably not even close to the amount you'd get into. I was asked by some weirdo in a costume to join them, but unless I was going to be the leader I said no. He opened his eyes and looked at Luffy silver meeting brown sternly. If it brought me towards wherever you were I would do it, Captain. While Luffy was touched by those words he did think Zoro being recruited in something was kind of funny. What's with that look? Zoro asked his arms crossed as Luffy just looked away, hiding that his lips were pulled in together trying not to laugh. Boy Vivi sweat dropped as Zoro marched over and began to pull on Luffy's face, annoyed at the teen's behavior. This Wednesday, we really should be off now. The weird man who looked like a stupid king walked towards Vivi, giving her a kind smile as Luffy looked over at her as well, his face still being stretched by Zoro. Do you still want me to keep my promise? Luffy asked, not sure what to make of this situation. There is an island we need to return to, they will treat you kindly there. After that I'll expect you to keep that promise, have I made myself clear? Vivi's words made little sense to Luffy, who tilted his head annoyed at her tone. Clear? Zoro said, knowing that she had put on some sort of mask to hide herself. I'm not clear, Zoro. Luffy said, but the girl nodded her head, happily accepting the help while she could. While Luffy and Vivi were talking, Nami had gone to visit the man by the lighthouse because Luffy had told her he could help her understand the log pose. So you're Luffy's navigator? He said, not looking away from Luffy but acknowledging her presence all the same. Yeah, and he said you could help me with this. She put her wrist out for him to see the pose, but yet again he didn't even look at her. So that brat was smart enough to get you one of those, huh? He asked, but she shook her head. It was a letter from Marco that told me how to get it. She confessed to the man, who laughed. That man has a hard time letting his baby go. Crocus smiled, thinking back to the 1st Division commander with a tender smile who would watch over the little boy with the bright straw hat. I want to meet them, Luffy's family. She said as Crocus finally looked away from Luffy and gave her his attention. You will, I guarantee it. Though I would have to warn you, should you have eyes for that boy over there, Marco can be something fierce towards any who look at him the wrong way. Crocus said as Nami just stared at him. You don't have to worry there. She closed her eyes, fighting off a headache from annoyance. Just a warning, miss. He stood up, brushing off his pants and waving to Laboon, who was calling towards them, the paint finally drying. I have a gift for you, one that even Marco must not have been thinking about. Nami raised a brow at his words but followed him back to the lighthouse, where he opened a drawer searching for something. Ah, here it is. He touched something carefully, fondly, before turning towards Nami and tossing it to her as she fumbled with it slightly in her hands. What's this? She asked, looking at the object carefully. It's a special log pose, you won't need it now, but once you cross the red line again, that one you have on your wrist won't work that easily anymore. It's an older model, so you can replace it in Sabati if you like, but it will at least get you through the new world safely. Looking at the log pose in her hands, she could see the care that was given to it, much like how she cared for the one she already had. No need to replace something this valuable, it's perfect. Thank you. Nami was glad to take anything that could help her navigate the crew safely. The old man Usopp had let his curiosity overrule his fear of leaving the ship to talk to Crocus. I'm not that old brat, Crocus grumbled, but Usopp ignored him anyway. Have you always been taking care of a giant whale? It wasn't every day you stumbled upon a whale and took it in as a pet. That is a long story. Crocus's eyes had a sad glint in them for a moment, but Usopp caught it. I like stories, especially long ones. He sat down in front of the man, catching him by surprise as Nami joined him and Sanji moved closer towards them, listening, but still keeping an eye on the weird man on their ship. Zoro was still pushing Luffy towards the ship, with the girl, having heard the story, already knew he could repeat it to Zoro if he wanted to know. It was around 50 years ago when I met this pirate crew who had come over Reverse Mountain with their baby whale. He started as everyone who wanted to listen did so. They were pirates with a passion for music and adventure, but didn't want their whale friend Laboon here to be in any danger from the Grand Line, so they asked me to take care of him until they returned. So what happened to those pirates? Usopp asked, confused as to why the whale was still here. They never returned, so I joined the crew of the man named Gold D. Roger with the request that I can search for them for Laboon. He continued, his eyes growing distant. Did you find them? Nami asked, afraid of the answer. No, I had heard though that they had escaped the Grand Line through the calm belt, never having returned for the whale they left behind. It's a sad tale. Brook, one of the shipmates, was very fond of this guy and I never thought he'd never return. He said, sadly, looking at the whale that had a new mark on his nose. Luffy turned his eyes towards Laboon one more time, leaving Zoro behind with Vivi, a confused expression on their faces. Laboon, I know you're still sad about your old Nakama leaving you. Someday, when I am finished traveling the Grand Line and become the Pirate King, I swear to come back to see you. Luffy held out his hand towards Laboon, welcoming him to his little family as the whale teared up. Boy, you guys ready? Luffy called, but a feeling of pride was filling the small crew at the way Luffy acted. Amen. Nami and Usopp waved to Crocus before joining Sanji and the others on the Mary. You'll keep that promise, Luffy? Crocus asked him as Luffy looked back, a smirk on his face. I never make promises that I can't keep, he said, jumping on the railing of his ship and waving to his friends behind him. So you said there is somewhere we need to take you? Zoro asked the girl, Miss Wednesday she called herself. Yes, there we will treat you to food and then we'll forever be out of your way, she said as her partner nodded, a small dirty smile on his face that led Zoro to think this might be a trap. You and Luffy? He needed his captain's permission. Sounds fun, and I have a promise to keep. With that the small ship set off towards an island of fun and danger. The closer they got to it though the more upset Luffy was beginning to feel. Just where are we going, Vivi? Luffy asked under his breath as her partner slept on the deck, Zoro keeping an eye on him. You won't be here long, I promise, I just need to get my friend who's waiting on this island and we can go. She tried to reassure him, but he just didn't feel right. We won't be there long. He asked her as she placed a hand on his shoulder, smiling at him kindly. Man, just briefly, but this island is dangerous, so be careful. She said to him as he relaxed a bit. Did you forget who I am? Luffy asked her, his head leaning on his hand as he pouted, confusing her a little. The former WhiteBeard pirate. She asked him, but he buzzed at her, saying she was wrong. I was a former comrade of the Sunasuna clan, nothing's too dangerous for me. He said, giving her his brightest grin as her eyes widened before softening. Right, how could I ever forget? She said as he laughed a little. But really, being part of Pop's crew is going to be a continuing problem for me, isn't it? He asked, taking on a serious air now. Why would it be a problem? She sat down beside him now on the figurehead carefully. Because of the island's Pop's influence has touched everyone's going to still see me as WhiteBeard's youngest son, aren't they? He sounded a little sad to Vivi, who didn't like to hear him like this. Then you'll have to prove to them that you're more than your father's name. Just like I am known as the princess, no matter where I go, you will be seen as your father's son everywhere you go. We both have a tough job, but I believe that someday we can make a bigger name for ourselves than what our fathers have. Luffy looked at her, his eyes wide slightly. Someday I'll be a great princess for my people and you a famous pirate captain. We can't give up no matter what. He closed his eyes and smiled at her, her words of encouragement had really helped. Thanks, Vivi. She let his shoulder go and gave him her brightest smile. What are little sisters for if not cheering up their older brother? He nodded at her. What are we going to do with your partner guy there? He asked, pointing his thumb back towards the sleeping idiot. He will have comrades on the island we're heading towards, it will be better if we abandon him as soon as we can. Sounds like a plan to me. Zoro was now leaning against the figurehead as Luffy blinked, because usually he could sense when one of his nakama were behind him. Don't look at me like that, idiot, you were so into your conversation there was no way you could sense anything else around you. He said as Luffy just smiled sheepishly. Luffy's Zoro stood up now, stretching a little before turning to fully look at him. No matter whom your family is, you'll always be Luffy to me. With those words he walked away, grumbling about Nami hiding the expensive bottles of liquor. You guys are quite the team. Vivi said, building her mask back up so her partner wouldn't realize she was anything but an agent. We're more than a team, Vivi, we're brothers. X. When they got to the island, the feeling in Luffy's gut was strongly telling him this place wasn't what it appeared to be. But it looked so fun, he whined a little to himself, causing a few around him to look confused. Mister, come have a drink with us. A few ladies came running up to Sanji, who had hearts in his eyes. Of course. He shouted as they latched onto his arm, leading him away. Boy, Sanji, Luffy said, not really liking that his friend was falling into the ways of this place. Nah, want to have a drink with us, mister? A few random people asked Zoro, holding some booze up in front of his face. Sounds good to me. He said, giving a grin, catching Luffy by surprise. Zoro. Was all he said, and softly, knowing that Zoro would hear him. If you act suspicious they'll probably attack, don't be reckless, Luffy. He replied in the same soft voice as his captain. But Sanji. He was worried for his friend. That chef may be stupid, but he isn't that stupid, shouldn't you have faith in your family, Luffy? He asked as Luffy's eyes widened a bit. Have faith. Pop's voice echoed in his mind, those words having been spoken to him countless times throughout his life. Right, I'll be counting on you to watch his back. Luffy said happily as Usopp shook his head, smiling, and Nami winked, both having heard the conversation deciding to play along. This will be like a game, right, Luffy? Usopp asked, throwing his arms behind his head and following a few people into a building for a feast. Let's make it fun then, shall we? Nami said, pulling a spare berry out of her pocket, kissing it as a few men began to swarm her, offering to get her a drink. That woman, oi Luffy, who said I'll keep an eye on the shit cook? He's your problem. Zoro shouted, but Luffy was already gone, the scent of food too much for him to take. That idiot, Zoro grumbled as the drinkers called him to join them. I guess I have no choice in the matter. He looked back towards the blue-haired girl, Vivi, he thought her name was, or at least that's what Luffy was calling her. We're going on ahead, do what you need to do so we can get out of here quick. He commanded as she blinked at him, surprised by his command. Alright. Now that the girl could get her stuff finished, Zoro needed to keep an eye on Luffy and the others, just in case. This island didn't feel right to him, so he didn't want to stay for very long. No matter how much booze they offered him. Welcome, travelers, to our wonderful town. A man with a loud voice shouted, catching the crew's attention away from the activities going on around them. "Who's the old guy? He looks somewhat familiar," Luffy said, grabbing another chunk of meat and stuffing it in his mouth. "My name is Igarappoi, and tonight we shall have a celebration in your honor, brave sailors," he said as many cheered, but the crew trusted Luffy's instincts and Zoro knew what was going on from that girl and his captain, so honestly no one was going to completely let loose this night. "Oh man, I don't think I could fight even if I wanted to." Luffy patted his enlarged stomach, completely content with the amount of food he had eaten. "Have you ever turned into a blob before?" Zoro asked him, giving his rounded body a weird look. "Nope, Thatch always made sure I ate a good amount of food but never let me overeat, said something about not wanting me to get fat." He just chuckled at his memory. "Can you get fat?" He had genuine curiosity there. No, but probably not, I mean I'm rubber after all." As if being rubber was the answer to all the questions in the world, for Luffy it probably was, and if it wasn't, then it must be a mystery. "It's getting late." Zoro looked around, the calm was really unsettling. Man, I hope Vivi finds her friend soon so we can go. I'm getting tired of this place even though they give good meat," Luffy said, starting to suck up the fat in his body, giving him energy to move around again. "You do know that thing you're doing is really weird, right?" Luffy's weirdness was yet again a reminder that this place wasn't normal. "Really?" Luffy said before standing up, looking around him. "What's wrong?" Zoro asked, standing up now beside him, his hand on his blade just in case. "Others have come to the island," he said, looking round him. "I take it they're not the friend that girl was looking for," he said as Luffy frowned. "We should go soon, this place doesn't feel right. You boys should be sleeping," a voice said from behind them as a few of the townspeople smirked at them, weapons in their hands. "Told you this place didn't feel right, Zoro," Luffy said, his blob form gone, and now the normal Luffy stood. "But these people aren't worthy enough to fight us, are they?" Zoro asked, causing a few of them to glare at his words. "Nah, you got them covered, Zoro. I want to go find Vivi so we can go." Zoro didn't even tie his bandana around his head, knowing this fight wasn't even worth that. "Get going," was all he said as Luffy laughed and took a step before turning back and making a face. "Don't kill the whole town, they did feed us after all," he said sternly as Zoro resisted the urge to roll his eyes at his simple-minded captain. Fine, just go already." "Shishishi." Luffy ran, dodging a few bounty hunters or just knocking them straight out of his way. "I don't have time for people like you," he yelled, but they kept coming no matter what. "And here I thought you guys were nice." He did know the island was a trap, but that didn't stop him from wanting to believe in the people here. "Firebird's star." A flamed bird came towards Luffy, knocking a few of the people out of Luffy's way with a cry. "Usopp!" Luffy shouted in surprise as the long-nosed sniper had his glasses over his eyes so he could see properly, but stood proud at what he had done, even if his knees shook slightly. "Get going, Luffy, Nami and Sanji are already doing what they can, so we can get out of here faster," he said as Luffy nodded, letting Usopp take on the people in this area. As he ran past a bunch of people he saw his crew in action. Nami had knocked people off of the Mary with a metal rod, it must be new. And Sanji was kicking anyone who wasn't a lady into the street and walls of buildings. Usopp was helping watch Zoro's back and even kept his eyes on Sanji as well, just in case he needed to help where he could. Luffy couldn't have felt more proud of his crew that could hold its own. "Vivi!" he shouted, seeing the girl he had been searching for riding towards him on what appeared to be a duck of some sorts. "Geez, I finally found you, we need to go now," she said, but his attention was pulled towards the duck. "I don't remember you having a duck," he said, pouting, because he wanted a duck as well. If she had told him about the ducks when they were kids, maybe he could have talked Marco into letting him have one. "Haru isn't important right now," she said in slight annoyance, because they were in danger and needed to get out of there soon. "Not before you tell us what's going on." Nami had come beside them, the small crew gathering now that a bunch of beaten bounty hunters were laying in the streets unconscious. "What about the agents?" Vivi looked around, not seeing them. "I knocked them back, but they won't stay down long. Explanations are in order so we can go." Zoro said, his bandana on his head now, showing Luffy that he had to actually fight seriously this night. "Luffy, the last time you came to my country you said you felt something weird about it," Vivi said as Luffy nodded, remembering the weird feeling he had when he visited there as a kid. "Has it changed any?" he asked her as she looked down, her bangs covering her eyes now causing Luffy to frown. "It's gotten worse. My country is no longer peaceful and it's all because of Baroque works," she said to Luffy. "But don't you work for them?" Nami asked her, frowning. "I'm an undercover agent with Igaram to get as much information on the boss crocodile." With that, Nami's eyes widened in fear and shock. "But he's one of the warlords of the sea," she exclaimed as Luffy and Zoro looked thoughtful. "So he's strong?" Luffy asked as Nami shouted at him. "He has a really high bounty and is known to be ruthless," Nami yelled, but Luffy smiled. "I remember Pops coming to your island because it was having a crocodile problem, or that's what Thatch said." So this must be the problem, why didn't we just fix it for you then? Luffy asked, knowing his pops could have beaten this crocodile guy. Because we didn't want help, our country has always been proud to be independent, and being a part of the world government attaching ourselves to a pirate crew wouldn't benefit the people. We tried to take care of things on our own, she said as a weird-looking man dressed like a girl came into view. But we failed, and for that you must return to Alabasta, Princess Vivi. The weird man said. Igaram? She said, but then stopped looking at high attire. Why are you dressed like that? She finally asked, not sure what to think about this. He stopped and cleared his throat before singing some scales and looking back at her. I am going to pretend to be you, princess. The other agents know now of our undercover mission, and you, brave people, have been spotted with the princess, making you targets of the organization as well. You and our crew have now been added to the Baroque Works death list. He said as Nami paled and Usopp's mouth dropped. Sanji light up a new smoke, closing his eyes, taking it in as Zoro, and Luffy smirked in excitement. So Crocodile knows we're coming. Zoro said, wanting to fight another strong person again. Death list, huh, sounds like fun. Luffy smiled but got shouted at by both Usopp and Nami. It's not fun. We could be killed. But Igaram began to beg them to take the princess home to her home country. Fine, but under one condition. Nami said, holding up her finger in the man's face. Of course, anything. He began, hope in his voice. We expect to be paid for this. She said, crossing her arms as Luffy opened his mouth to object. It costs a lot for supplies, Luffy, we're pirates now, we can't just take on things without a price involved. She said as Luffy closed his mouth but didn't like that his little sister was being charged to go home. Of course we shall pay you. As long as you get the princess home we will do anything for you. He said before throwing her a log pose. Princess, I am asking that you give me the eternal pose. After a few stops along the way I ask that you hurry back to Alabasta. I've never actually done it myself, but I believe that with only 3 stops and following the log pose carefully, you should make it safely to your home, Princess Vivi. He said as she stared at him, a form of silent communication going between them. I know you from when you were a child, Luffy, I'll be counting on you. He said, turning away from the group and running towards a group of bounty hunters. Let's get going. Luffy said, jumping up and pulling Vivi with him, her duck following beside the running group. Over here. I'm Princess Vivi. Igaram yelled, catching the attention of a few people who began to chase him, instead giving the crew a chance to get to the Mary. The moment they landed and pulled the sails free, Vivi looked back to see the ship Igaram got on explode and sink in a blaze of fire. Igaram! She shouted, tears in her eyes, Luffy holding her back, not letting her jump the ship to go to her friend. We need to keep moving, I'm sorry. He said as she cried into his shoulder. We'll get you home. I swear. Sanji said to Vivi, trying to calm her down some as a sad air fell over the crew, even if they really didn't know that guy. You guys actually escaped. A voice said, but no one actually registered where it was coming from. Luckily, that guy really helped us. Usopp said, a bit sad, but happy they got away from this island. You should keep an eye out for the shallows so you don't strike the hull. The voice said. Nami smiled, touching her wrist. You can count on me. She said before freezing completely. Was that you talking, Luffy? She asked suddenly, but Luffy gave her a look since he was busy calming Vivi down. You have quite a nice ship here. She said, leaning on her hand, smiling sweetly at the paralyzed crew. Just who the heck are you? Zoro asked, touching his swords, his fingertips blackening, warning her that he wasn't going to go down easy. You're Vivi began in panic as Luffy let her go, but stood by her, guarding her silently. I saw Mr. 8 not that long ago, Miss Wednesday. She said, giving a smile, but something about this woman threw Luffy off. She sounded cold and mean, but he felt something underneath that, something familiar. You killed Igaram. She shouted at Robin, but Luffy stepped in the way of her path, blocking Vivi from doing anything. You know, even if she did, I still want to know why you're on my ship. Just who are you? Luffy asked her, his eyes meeting the icy blue, neither looking away from one another. Why are you here, Miss All Sunday? Vivi screamed, trying to move past Luffy, but found he blocked her path completely. Who is her partner? Nami asked, her voice shaking slightly. She's the boss's partner, Crocodiles. She spat, scaring Nami and Usopp. So you're a bad guy then? Luffy asked her as she laughed. When you put it that way, Robin said, but Luffy continued to just stare at her. She's the only one who is actually allowed to know the boss's true identity, which is probably why she's here. Igaram and I were shadowing her for a long time to find out just who the boss really was. She said, her eyes filled with anger and pain. Rather, child, I let you shadow me. She said, smiling still. Oh, so you're really a good guy then, thank goodness. Luffy said, smiling now, but the crew wasn't sharing any of Luffy's cheer. I knew it. So the one who told the boss about us knowing his identity was you, wasn't it? Vivi asked, but knew the answer. Of course. She said, as if just stating the facts. Oh, and here I thought you were a good guy, Luffy said, putting a little because something was telling him this person was more than they seemed. Luffy, don't get yourself more involved. Zoro snapped, tension in the air. What do you want from me? She yelled. Who knows? Really, a princess though who thought she could make enemies of Crocodile and save her country from despair. That's ridiculous. With those words Vivi wanted to scream with anger but was held back by Luffy once again. What do you want from us? Luffy asked her as Usopp readied his slingshot and Sanji lifted a foot even if Luffy knew he could never hurt the lady and this was all show. Nami had pulled out her weapon, the protectiveness of her crewmates shining in her eyes. There's no need for you to point those dangerous things towards me. She said, but she sounded annoyed, so using her abilities, she pushed Usopp and Sanji into the water as well as disarming Nami easily and trying to take Zoro's sword. The woman was skilled at using her ability, but not even death could separate him from his swords, so why should she? Zoro, that's enough. Luffy said, so the swordsman put his blade back on his hip but his silver eyes never left the cold blue in warning. What kind of ability is that? Nami asked, picking herself up off the deck. You know, you're actually kind of beautiful. Sanji said, a heart dancing around his head. I have no reason to fight you. She said as Luffy smiled, glad he could just talk this out, but that was until she stole his hat right off his head. Found my reason. Luffy growled after he patted his head for a moment and locked eyes with a woman who was holding his hat surprisingly carefully. Give me back my hat. He said, and through his childish anger, there was a deathly quiet that the woman picked up on, while the others just caught his anger. You're not welcome on this ship. Usopp said, glaring at the woman who had taken Luffy's treasure, placing it on her own head carefully with a smile. You all sure have some bad luck picking up a princess our organization wants dead. Though I do believe that your worst luck will be the next island you're being directed to. She pointed to the log pose as Nami looked at it in fear before something came flying toward her as she fumbled to catch it. That's an eternal pose. Vivi cried out as Nami looked at it carefully. But this you can avoid the next island altogether, none of my agents know about this place and it's fairly close to Alabasta, so it should be a smoother trip for you. She said as Nami looked at her suspiciously. Luffy frowned before looking up at the woman who had a look on her face, something was bugging him about her in his mind. Looking at her again, his eyes widened a little, she reminded him of Ace. That cold mask she was wearing reminded him of the one Ace wore when they first met as kids. But it was the sadness embedded into her eyes that really pulled him. Even though Ace had a home with him and a family, there was always that little bit of sadness mixed with anger in his eyes that never faded, just hid behind the joy and love he now had, but it always showed the scars on his brother's heart. Maybe she too had deep scars, ones bad enough to force her into wearing this mask. Whether or not that was the case didn't matter at this particular moment in time. Luffy pushed Vivi out of the way, walking towards Nami, grabbed the eternal pose and crushed it into nothingness in his hands before looking at the woman. I left my pop's crew to become my own man, I will not let anyone decide the course of this ship. Neither one of them moved, seizing each other up, remembering each other for another day. I expected nothing less from a man who carries the name of D, she whispered quietly, no one else hearing her but Luffy. You blew up that crossdressing guy, so I hate you. He said, but the woman didn't hear hate in his words, just anger and a bit of what seemed to be disappointment. If you do survive, I hope we meet again, Minky D. Luffy. She said, her eyes taking him in before she jumped from the ship onto a sea turtle, taking her away from them. No, I really hope we don't. He said, turning away from her and looking at his tired crew as they waited his orders. This island we're going towards sounds like fun. Luffy said as they all sighed, taking in his big smile. Yet an island filled with danger, great fun, Luffy. Usopp said, relaxing, following Luffy to the kitchen where Sanji was about to prepare a small light breakfast for them. Luffy? Vivi called out to him as he stopped and looked back at her, taking in how tired she really looked. Thank you. She said, tears brimming her eyes. We're family and family looks out for one another. He said as Nami put an arm around the girl. Here, why don't we go get a bath and some fresh clothes before eating, it's been a long night. She said as Vivi followed beside her, accepting the kindness given. It had been a long night for the crew, but now they had a plan, a destination, nothing could stand in their way. At an island in the Grand Line. The island was burning, there was barely anything left of it, and that saddened a few of the WhiteBeard crew. What happened here? Ace asked, looking around. It felt as though this place had been a lively island not too long ago, and now. Standing around isn't going to tell us anything. Thatch said, his eyes narrow and his hand on his blade, you could feel the anger falling off of him in waves. Was the group that was here in your division, Thatch? Ace asked carefully, but the look he was given proved him right. We'll find them, I promise. He vowed as Thatch walked away, his haki searching for any survivors on this island. Thatch, Ace over here. Someone called and the two came running. Shinji. Thatch saw one of his division bloodied and barely conscious, so he carefully lifted the man, placing his head on his lap and supporting his neck with his hands. What happened? Who did this? It was a question, but everyone could hear it was more than that. It was Teach. The man choked out, grabbing the commander's shirt, staining it with blood. What did he do? Where are the others in your group, Yoi? Marco flew in and landed beside the growing group. They're all dead. He cried as Thatch closed his eyes and gritted his teeth in anger and sadness. Why would he attack? Thatch finally asked after a moment of silence for his fallen brothers. He wants to get something from the government. I don't know what. We didn't ask him. He said, his eyes looking far away. He needs something important, someone important to bargain with. He had Luffy's bounty poster, he said, as a feeling of dread and fear hit each and every person close to the man to hear those words. He's going after Luffy because he can get something from the government if he trades Luffy in, the man said, his voice getting weaker. The nurses were rushing in with Pops, who had heard the man's words, anger filling his body. His one trader was bring him more pain. We'll find him, there's no way he'll ever touch my brother. Ace said, his black eyes shining in the flames from the burning island. Our brother, you're not going alone, Yoi. Marco said, turning to look at his father. The old man was watching his sons. Pops, since I became your son many years ago, I have not once left your side. Now, Luffy's life could be in danger, and if I don't go to help him, I don't think I could live with myself, Yoi. He said, his voice pleading, hoping his father understood. Teach is stronger now than he was those years ago, my sons, don't underestimate him. Pop said as Marco nodded, turning to Ace. Ace and I will go together to have each other's backs, Yoi. He said as Ace nodded, accepting Marco's help. I'm staying here. Thatch said as the nurses and doctor took Shinji away. My division has been hit hard yet again by this asshole, but Shinji will need me to be here for him. I need to find the bodies of my siblings and give them a proper burial. Shinji also may have more information when he's strong enough, so I'll keep in contact as best as I can. Thatch said as the two commanders nodded. Take these, keep in contact. Haruta came to them, giving 3 baby transponder snails as Ace looked at the third one. You're too small to come with us. He said as she punched him over the head. It's for Luffy. I doubt anyone gave him one when he left, and I'm older than you or Brad. She snarled, but it was good-naturedly. But still shorter. Ace said with a smile, trying to brighten up the sad mood. Marco, Ace, be safe, my sons. Pop said as the two went to grab what they will need for their trip. How many years has it been since you've left home? Ace asked Marco once they were ready, taking one last look at the Moby Dick. Too many to count, Yoi. Let's go, we should probably try and find Luffy first so he knows what is happening. Marco said as Ace got the bigger striker ready for the two of them. Right, there's no way in hell anyone will harm him, let alone that traitor. Ace had conviction in them both to protect Luffy. Ace, hold on to this, Yoi. Marco ripped a piece of his Beaver card and handed it to Ace, who looked at it. Should we get separated, I'll be able to find you and you me, Yoi. He ripped a piece off of Ace's and put it in his pocket. Let's try and keep together. Ace smiled as Marco nodded. That's the plan, but your plans don't stay plans with people like you, Yoi. The two set sail in search of Luffy and the traitor, while Luffy made his way towards another adventure, and all WhiteBeard could do was hope his son stayed safe and returned home as soon as possible. Sabo twirled the cord in his fingers as the transponder snail made an expression of annoyance. I already figured Teach was going after Luffy, I've been keeping my eyes on him for a while, Ace. Sabo said as the snail's eye twitched ever so slightly. Why didn't you let me know you were watching Teach? Ace asked as Sabo sighed. It's not like I can just call you every time something happens, Ace. I've got a lot going on here as well, you know. Sabo was getting tired of arguing with his brother, even if he did really miss him. We're going after Teach, you know, stop him before he gets the chance to get to Luffy. Ace said as Sabo nodded. Be careful, you're not going alone, are you? He asked seriously. Of course not, I have Mama Marco to babysit me. He joked, but Sabo could hear Marco smack Ace in the background. WhiteBeard is strong, Ace, he's got some serious power behind him now and a weird disturbing crew backing him up. Sabo said, carefully, needing the two of them to understand that Teach wasn't just a member of a division anymore, but a real threat. WhiteBeard? Ace said, but even Sabo could hear the disgust behind his brother's tone. A play off of Pop's name, I figured, just be careful, alright? Call me if you need help, I'll do what I can. Sabo said, his tone pleading for Ace for once in his life not be reckless. I'll keep an eye on him, Yoi. Marco had taken the receiver away from Ace. You be careful as well, from what I've learned he does something to devil fruit users, but I don't have enough information on it yet. He said as Marco made a hum in understanding. Thank you for helping us, Sabo, I know this all must be hard for you, Yoi. Marco's voice was soft, which made Sabo calm down some. From what my sources have gathered, Luffy should be heading towards an island called Drum, it's a winter island, maybe stop in there. Sabo asked, hoping he was putting them on the right path. I know the island, I have an old friend that lives there yoi. Sabo nodded, glad that Ace had Marco to show him the way. Be safe, my brothers. Sabo said, finally putting the receiver down and taking a deep breath. Was that Ace-kun? A girl asked, her look stylish and cute, not that he'd ever admit that to her. Man, they're heading towards Luffy. He said as she put her hands behind her back and hummed at him, smiling. Someday I'd like to meet your brothers, Sabo-kun. She said, following beside him. Yeah, maybe someday, Cola. She smiled, glad he was brightening up some. The talk about Blackbeard heading towards the rookie pirate Straw Hat Luffy had put him on edge. I heard the chef's making some sweets, let's go steal some. She encouraged, pulling him towards the galley. Dragon watched the two of them go, his face showing no expression over the conversation he had heard from his second in command, as a feeling he both knew and even dreaded crept up his spine, alerting him to a presence he didn't really want to deal with. Of all the times. He whispered, walking down the hall silently but quickly before that person caused trouble. Dragon-san? Sabo asked as the man walked past the two, who looked at him surprised to see him. And here I thought I'd have to search everywhere to find you. A female voice said from behind a pillar. Sabo and Cola froze before both took on a battle stance, ready to fight. I don't play games, woman. He said as the voice laughed softly at him before the owner of it stepped into the light, her eyes flashing with amusement. I remember. She said, offering her hand to him, but Dragon turned on his heels, walking away, leaving a confused Cola and Sabo behind him as the woman dropped her hand back to her side. Are you coming or not? He stopped to ask as she shook her head, her eyes turning towards the two staring at her cautiously. What cute children. She said, a smile on her face as she followed behind Dragon, humming a light tune only she seemed to know. Once they got to his office, he motioned for her to enter before closing the door. You haven't changed a day, have you, Dragon? She asked, sitting on his desk much to his annoyance. You want to talk, Lexa, what do you want? He asked her as her smile dropped from her face. Blackbeard's head, really, but seeing him dead would be good enough for me. She returned the smile to her face, but Dragon refused to smile. He is of no concern to me, let WhiteBeard clean up his own mess. Dragon said dismissively, feeling the air in the room chill. You don't care that he's after Luffy? She asked him, her voice frozen cold. He has a large family to look after him, I doubt he needs my assistance. So you don't care that a psychopath is after your son? What kind of father are you? She scoffed as he turned to look at her, his dark ebony eyes staring into clear blue. Our son seems strong enough to take care of himself. Dragon countered, not looking away from her, and you dare question me on parenting skills? He asked her as she crossed her legs, puffing her cheeks out in annoyance. I've been watching over Luffy a lot longer than you. Who do you think spread that rumor about the Pirate King's son being in the East Blue? She asked. You still act like the world is nothing but a game, and that will be your downfall, Lexa. What did you hope to get out of that rumor? Dragon sighed, knowing she would avoid the answer he wanted. It turned out, didn't it? I mean, Garp did bring that boy to Luffy, so it's not a problem. She uncrossed her legs and jumped off of the desk, scattering papers everywhere, further annoying him. I'm not asking you to hunt him down, Dragon, just help me a little in keeping Luffy safe, that's all I'm asking. She said, touching Luffy's bounty poster on the desk, picking it up between her fingers and staring down at it. I wonder who here resembles. She smiled softly, pushing a strand of long black hair behind her ear. Did we make the right choice giving him to those pirates? Did we make the right choice about anything in his life, our lives? It's too late to go back now. Dragon said, looking away, because he chose this life. He chose the life of a revolutionary over the woman he once cared for, over his son. Luffy loved being with his family. Dragon didn't even turn as Sabo opened the door, his eyes blazing at the woman who looked mildly surprised, while Dragon knew the boy would not hesitate when Luffy was being spoken of. I didn't think you'd just barge in. What a funny child you are. She set her full attention towards him. He smiled. She asked him now as Sabo nodded. Often, and still does. She closed her eyes, rolling the bounty poster up and placing it in her pocket. Good. She turned her eyes towards Dragon, and for the first time he thought she looked tired. Keep an eye on Blackbeard, that's all I wanted. We plan to. He said as she followed Sabo into the corridor. You know my son well then? She asked as Sabo looked her over carefully. He's my brother. I'm glad, will you do me a favor? She asked, stopping in front of him. He looked at her cautiously. Depends. Don't tell Luffy, or anyone really, that you met me. I'm not exactly a welcome face around pirates and apparently revolutionaries. She smiled sadly. Why not? When you work in the government, not too many outlaws find you fun. She said, stretching her arms up and laughing a little, but her words had caught Sabo's attention and curiosity. Man, I feel better now. Thanks for talking to me, kid. She said, turning once more and giving him a wide smile that didn't stretch like Luffy's but still held the same warmth. Luffy seems to be a lot like you, just putting that out there. He has family hunting down Blackbeard right now, and as much as I really should be pissed at you for putting Ace in unnecessary danger when we were kids, it brought us to Luffy, so I'm not too mad. Though before you go I have one final question for you. She smirked at him. It had been a long time since someone treated her like a friend. Shoot. She said happily. How did you know things would turn out okay, for Ace I mean? Putting him in danger like that could have backfired and caused a lot of trouble. She thought about it as they walked in silence for a moment. I didn't really think about it and guess, I knew Garp was hiding the boy, I was there after all when the kid was born. I just thought it might be lonely for Luffy to be all by himself with pirates, having kids around might be more entertaining. She smiled at her own words as Sabo shook his head. They were at the end of the base now. So this is goodbye. She said. Sabo nodded as she reached into her pocket and ripped a piece of paper. This is my Viver card. Dragon has one as well, but should you need me you know where to find me. She said, passing him the card before running towards her guard to take her home, waving as she went. Well, that was interesting, Sabo said, looking down at the Viver card. Alexa's silver. The word from the wise. Sabo stopped as Dragon stood before him in the hallway, his eyes looking down at Sabo. Be careful trusting her with anything. She works in the world government and lives with the beliefs that the world is nothing but a game. Be careful what you tell her. Dragon said to Sabo, but even he could hear it was an order. Yes, sir. Sabo said, looking down at the Viver card in his hand carefully. Much like Luffy, Sabo couldn't help but wonder what storm she brought with her. X. Leaving the island little garden, Luffy crossed his arms, thinking on the figurehead about the events that had happened. The wax guy was fun and his armor was pretty cool. The giants were really fun and made Usopp smile a lot, so Luffy liked them even more for that. What had brought him to the figurehead to think though was the little girl who painted. Luffy knew his haki was good but not quite strong enough to be up to his brother's level. When she painted on him it felt like all his willpower had been drained from him. He fought with all his might and still nothing happened. His friends were in danger and yet he was useless. Something had happened though, something even he couldn't quite explain. One moment he was trapped in the powers of the little girl and the next he was free from them. He thought it was his observation haki letting him see through her abilities, but it didn't feel that way. It felt new, something never touched on before. It could be his king's haki growing stronger, but it didn't even feel like that. Whatever it was, it felt almost like taking a breath after being underwater for a long time. When he was trapped under her abilities it was like he was drowning, then all of a sudden he felt a weird sensation crawl over his body and he was able to pull himself out of her ability. Luffy? Zoro was watching him carefully, but he wasn't the only one. Luffy had been silent for now going on 2 hours, which set off warning bells in everyone's mind. Boy rubber brain. I brought you a snack. Sanji was worried about Luffy but silently watched from a distance. Having spent time with his captain he knew Luffy liked to observe and think every once in a while. Ah. Awesome. Thanks, Sanji. Luffy grabbed the meat off the plate and began to devour it as fast as he could. All that thinking probably made you hungry, didn't it? Sanji asked with a small smile as Luffy nodded, taking another bite of the meat. What were you thinking about? Zoro asked, sitting down on the deck, placing his blades beside him. I dunno how to explain it, he said through mouthfuls, earning a scolding quickly from Sanji. Do you ever? Sanji joked, but this time Luffy shook his head, scratching an itch that had been bothering him for a few hours. Can you try? Zoro asked, since it was rare for Luffy to let something bother him into silence. When we were on that island and I got trapped by that girl I was able to break free somehow, but I don't know how, he confessed. Damn, that itch was really annoying now. Didn't we just remove the shirt you were wearing that had her colors on it? Zoro asked, but Luffy shook his head at his friends. I broke out long before that happened. I don't know how to explain it honestly, maybe I should ask Pops, he said, but his words were a little slurred. Boy, did you do something to Luffy's food? Zoro turned to look at Sanji, but the shock on the cook's face proved that Sanji was innocent. Luffy? Zoro grabbed his captain and Luffy fell forward, a fever burning Luffy's skin. I'm fine, just thinking too much. Guys, we have a problem. Vivi called down to the boys who were struggling with Luffy. Yeah, so do we. Zoro yelled back, placing Luffy onto his back, his breath coming out sharper. Nami's sick. She yelled as Sanji's face paled as Zoro gritted his teeth. So is Luffy. Sanji looked at his captain, his heart being pulled in 2 different directions. Check on Nami or stay with his best friend. Damn it. Get them to a bed fast. Sanji said as Zoro picked Luffy up, bringing him to the sick area. What happened? They both collapsed at the same time. Usopp asked, looking at Luffy as Sanji and Vivi were checking on Nami. He was fine, complaining about an itch of some sort, Zoro said, watching Luffy, breath heavily, wrapped up in blankets. What should we do? Usopp was worrying greatly now. I think it's obvious, we need to find a doctor fast. Zoro said as Luffy grabbed Zoro's shirt, causing him to stop. Rest. Zoro said, but Luffy's clouded eyes stopped him, so he sighed, pulling a chair closer to the bed and plopping himself down in it. You're sick. Zoro said as Luffy looked at the ceiling. I'm not that sick, he said, but Zoro frowned at him. We'll find a doctor to make you better. Zoro reassured, but Luffy bit his lip in annoyance. Zoro looked at Usopp silently, letting him know he needed to talk with Luffy alone. What's wrong? Zoro asked softly, kindly. I feel weak. At those words Zoro sighed. You're allowed to feel weak every once in a while, Luffy, you can't be strong forever. Zoro said calmly to Luffy, who just sunk more into the bed. How's Nami? He asked under covers of blankets. Sick as well, but we'll figure this out. Zoro reassured him, letting Luffy fall asleep. How is he? Vivi asked, a frown on her face. He'll survive as he always does, but I don't like to push luck too far when my family is involved. We need to find them a doctor. Zoro said to her, and she nodded. We'll be coming up on a winter island in a few days. I'm not as skilled as Nami, but I can direct us there if you can keep things under control here. She said to him as he nodded, glad they had the princess on their ship now. The crew went about being as best as they could, while their navigator and captain were bedbound, but with Vivi's promise of the doctor they kept themselves together as best as they could. Nami? Luffy wrapped his blankets around himself and wandered to the room he knew she had claimed as her own. You look like crap. She stated, just turning her head to the side to look at him. You look worse. He said, but it wasn't a joke and she wasn't laughing. We're going to go see a doctor and get better. He told her, taking the chair by the bed, wrapping his blanket more securely around himself, trying to stop the shivers, but failing. I'd offer you to come in the bed, but Sanji might kill you, sick or not. She laughed before coughing. I'm okay right here. It was late at night now and everyone was either resting or letting the two talk. We need to get to Alabasta, Luffy. Nami said after a few moments of silence. We need to find a doctor. He reminded her as she shook her head. You and I both know we don't have time for that. Vivi's country is falling apart as we speak. She said sadly as Luffy looked out the dark window, a few stars poking their light through, the moon full and round. Things look pretty dark, don't they? He said, still looking out the window as she nodded her head. When I was little I was afraid of the dark for a while. Luffy said, his arms pulling the blanket tighter around him. I would run to any room that was closest to me in the middle of the night, with my eyes shut tight, hoping the monsters wouldn't get me. He chuckled along with Nami's light laughter. I can see that happening. She was happy he was telling her more about him. One of those nights I ran to Pops and he told me that there is no such thing as absolute darkness. He looked towards her now. There is always a little bit of light, you just need to look for it, that's all. That night he brought me out on the deck and we watched the stars until morning. Things might look dark in Vivi's home, but the light is that we're on our way, Nami. We'll get there, and when we do we'll bring back the light, but first we need to get better. He stood up as Usopp knocked on the door. You guys alright? He asked through the closed door. Yeah, I'm heading back to bed now. Luffy called to Usopp, hearing his footsteps move away from the door. Night, Nami, he said quietly, excusing himself from the room. Night, Luffy. She replied quietly, pulling the blanket up to her chin and falling asleep, dreaming that night of dancing stars. Ace and Marco got to Drum Island pretty quickly, only to be greeted by silent and cautious villagers. They don't look too happy to see us. Ace said, observing the people around him. We are pirates, Yoi. Marco said, looking around for someone who might be a friendly face to talk to. Pirates aren't exactly welcome here. A man said, walking towards the pair, who was relaxed in stance to not upset any of the villagers. We figured by the looks we're getting, Yoi. Marco said, reaching his hand out to the man, who took it in return. It's been a long time, Marco the Phoenix. The man smiled, grabbing the hand firmly, a smile on both of their faces. And you are? Ace asked, feeling left out of the bro moment. Forgive my rudeness, my name is Dalton and I was the head of the royal guard here in Drum. He said as the group walked, the man waving to a few people as he walked by. Was Yoi? Marco asked as Dalton nodded. We were recently attacked by pirates which made the king run away like the coward he is. He said in disgust. I see, but it feels more peaceful here now, Yoi. Marco looked around, and while the people looked like they didn't have a lot, they seemed happy. We do what we can. He laughed, rubbing his head in embarrassment. That's all anyone can ask for, Yoi. Marco smiled. Ace chose to look around, since it seemed Marco and this guy were deep in conversation. Why are you here, Marco? Dalton asked as Marco looked towards the forest. To see an old friend as well as one of my brothers, Yoi. He smiled, excited that Luffy might pass through here. You must mean that old witch, then. She's taken up residence in the old castle on the rocky drums. She doesn't come down often though, so it might be a wait. He said, but Marco turned his arm into a wing and smirked. For other people, I mean, it would be a wait. For you, well, you're a pirate, so do as you please. Dalton smiled. Nah, why is everyone looking at us? Ace asked, looking at the people who would stare, then look away as Dalton laughed loudly. It's not every day you see someone walk around this island without a coat on, let alone without a shirt. He smiled as Ace's cheeks tinted red. I'm fine, I don't feel cold easily, I don't need a shirt. He crossed his arms looking slightly annoyed. Relax Ace, he's not forcing you into clothing. You said this island was recently attacked by a group of pirates, right? Do you know whose flag they flew under, Yoi? Dalton stopped walking and turned back to look at Marco. He called himself Blackbeard. I still have no idea what he wanted here. He came in, tore up the village, scared away the king, not that anyone really minds that, and left. It was so confusing. Dalton said as Ace and Marco tensed. Do you know what direction he was headed? Ace asked through gritted teeth as Dalton gave the young adult a look. What we got was that he hated the cold, he complained a lot when he got to the village. Dalton sighed. He probably used that as an excuse to attack us, but with pirates you never know. Even to this day I have no idea what goes on in that man's mind, Yoi. Marco said quietly, sadly. A few days sailing and you'll run into the kingdom Alabasta, why not try your luck there? Dalton asked as Marco nodded, looking at Ace. Luffy might stop in here, Yoi. Ace wanted to keep going, but a huge part of him wanted to see Luffy again. We don't have time to waste, Marco, he said as the older man looked towards the shore, a sad spark in his blue eyes. I'll go on ahead to Alabasta and wait for you there. Ace sighed deeply. Dalton had excused himself to tend to other matters. We shouldn't separate, Ace, Yoi. Marco said sternly, but Ace held up his hand, stopping the man. I know better than getting in between you and Luffy when you miss the kid. I'll be in Alabasta, if Blackbeard is there I'll call you on this. He held the transponder snail up to Marco. And if Luffy doesn't come here, you know how to get there well enough. If he does show up though, hitch a ride and enjoy being with your son. Remember, when I see him next it's my turn, you hear me? Ace smirked as Marco sighed, letting the fire starter get a head start. If Blackbeard is there, don't start a fight, Ace, wait for me to back you up, Yoi. Ace nodded, placing his hat on his head and walking back to the striker, much to the villagers' relief. His heat was making their snow melt away. Ease you go and move all the way up there, Yoi. Marco walked towards the forest so when he transformed he didn't surprise the villagers. Once at a safe distance, Marco turned his arms into wings and flew to the castle waiting at the top of the mountain and landing outside the open door. You don't seem to be too frightened of strange people, do you, Kuriha, Yoi? Marco said loudly, hoping to alert the old doctor of his presence, though knowing her she already knew he was there. You're late, Feathers. An old lady said, leaning against the wall, a bottle of liquor in her hand and her eyes shaded by sunglasses. Sorry about that, Yoi. He said as she led him in, lifting her sunglasses to really take a look at him. You haven't changed a day. She said, but her voice held a bit of sorrow to her words. Neither have you, Yoi. Taking her hand in his and kissing it, he smiled a little as she laughed loudly. Picked up a new personality, have you, in your time at Seabird Brain? He smiled and laughed along with her. I live to adapt, Yoi. Out of the corner of his eye he saw a strange creature staring at him cautiously. I didn't think you were the pet type, Yoi. He said casually as the creature's eyes widened before narrowing. Shut up. I'm not a pet. He yelled before realizing he was out in the open and tried to hide himself again, but failing miserably. He's telling the truth, he's my student Tony Chopper. She introduced as the creature left them alone. And you tell me I've taken a new personality. I didn't think you were the teaching kind, Yoi. He accepted a bottle from her, taking a sip. It reminded him of old times. I made a promise to a friend. She said, laughing a bit as Marco smiled more. Isn't that how it always is, Yoi? Shut up and drink, I'd like to know why you're really here. She said to him as he swallowed his mouthful. I'm chasing a traitor who now calls himself Blackbeard, Yoi. She stopped and lowered the bottle away from her face. He was here not long ago. Marco nodded at those words. Yeah, Dalton told us. She tilted her head slightly. Us? One of my brothers came with me, Ace, he's headed towards Alabasta where I'll meet him shortly. How long will you be staying with me then? She asked him as he smiled at her, grateful for her hospitality. A few days, I'm waiting on someone who will probably be stopping by, Yoi. He said as she shook her head. There are plenty of empty rooms here, do as you wish. She said, waving her hand and leaving the room. Thanks. Dax. As the days continued, the crew's morale dropped more and more. Nami had taken a deep turn for the worse and Luffy looked awful as it was. Zoro stayed by their sides the entire time, going back and forth between Nami and Luffy. We're almost there, Luffy. Nami, you need to get better, we need the both of you. Usopp whispered, taking a deep breath, holding back tears. They will get better, I swear it. Zoro said to the sniper, who wiped his eyes on his sleeve, nodding. I know, it's just that I hate this. He said softly as Zoro placed a hand on Snipper's shoulder comfortingly. I know, we all do, but we're almost there, I can feel it. Zoro said, looking at Luffy, whose cheeks were flushed and skin a pale color. Everyone. I see it. The Winter Island. Vivi called, and Zoro smiled the first true smile in days. "See, what did I tell you?" he said, relief filling his voice as Usopp smiled as well. Zoro ran out on deck with Usopp right behind him, only to see some stupid man was attacking their ship. "Are you a pirate?" Zoro asked, his silver eyes flashing because honestly he wasn't in the mood to deal with anyone right now that wasn't a doctor. "That I am," the guy said before taking a bite of the ship, much to everyone's surprise. "Then you won't mind if I kill you, right?" Zoro pulled his sword out from his side and sliced the air, letting one of his minor projectile attacks, knocking the man backwards. "Boy. Get the ship moving, we have our captain and navigator to help," he shouted as everyone went into motion and the ship began to move. "You didn't kill him," Vivi said as they grew closer to the island. "I don't kill unless I have to," he said, smiling as the winter snow began to fall upon the deck. "But would you? Kill, I mean?" she asked as he looked at her. "If my captain and his crew is ever threatened to a point that I must, I will. My life belongs to this crew and I'd sacrifice anything for them," he said to her. "Not every battle needs to end in fighting," she said softly, but he still heard it. "But not every situation can be solved through words, you're a princess, right? Learn to balance between the two and you might make a great ruler," he said before heading back to Luffy's side. Vivi knew how to get the ship closer to the island and would call him up when they got there. "We're here, Luffy, Nami, we'll get you both better so I can kick your asses for scaring me so much." Luffy opened his eyes at Zoro's words and tried to laugh. "Sorry, Zoro," he managed to get out before closing them again, sleeping some more. "Don't apologize, idiot, just get better. They were here and through this darkness the crew would find a new light." X. The reindeer was looking out the window, puffs of cold air came out of his mouth as he breathed. "Doctrine, I think some more pirates are coming to the island," he said to his teacher, who leaned over him, seeing the villagers begin to scramble around and shouts being heard in the distance. "I do believe that may be so, Chopper." She smiled, then looked back at Marco, who was grinning. "I take it your brother must be here then?" she asked him as he stood up, pushing the two out of the way and turning his arm back into wings. "Thanks for the hospitality, Yoi." And with that he jumped from the window. "Must be special, this brother of his, to get the feather brain all worked up." She laughed, grabbing the bottle off the table. "I can't wait to meet him." Marco landed beside Dalton, who was shouting at a few villagers to get away from the shore. "Don't shoot them, Yoi," Marco said to the man, his voice slightly frantic. "Marco, we know, but we can't just accept every pirate that comes our way," he said, taking on a leadership tone of voice. "I get that, but these people are who I came here to see. My little brother and his crew are on that ship, Yoi." He needed Dalton to understand that he was going to protect his brother no matter what. Dalton didn't say anything, but watched as a few men pointed guns towards the ship, telling them to leave. Marco was ready to just walk past his friend and jump to the ship, no longer feeling the need to stay here any longer. "Pirates aren't welcome here. Go somewhere else," someone shouted as Marco began to take a step, but Dalton held his arm out, stopping Marco. "Wait," was all he said as Marco lifted a brow in confusion. "Please. Our nakama are sick and need medical attention fast," a female voice shouted to them, but the guns were still locked onto the ship. "Excuses? You want us to trust you enough to let you in? We won't fall for that," someone shouted and began to shoot. "If a bullet hits my brother, Yoi," Marco warned, his voice dropping in enough temperature to make the snow island feel warm. Marco heard a clash of metal and a startled yell, his eyes now being able to see just who was on the ship, and to his surprise Luffy was nowhere to be seen. "Are you alright, Vivi?" the green-haired man asked, his sword blocking her, the bullet on the deck having been blocked by his blade. "We won't dock ship here if that's what you want, but please call a doctor. Our navigator and captain are both very sick," he said as Marco's heart slowed ever so slightly. "Zoro," the girl said as the man did a bow from the waist, his eyes locked on with the man who fired the bullet, but instead of resentment or anger, Marco could only see pleading behind the silver. "That's enough, everyone, they mean us no harm." Dalton had put his arm down, letting Marco through, who didn't waste any time moving to the small ship, worry radiating from his body. "I'm looking for your captain, Yoi," he said carefully, not to startle anyone, as a few crew members eyed him carefully before the blonde and green-haired pair nodded and smiled weakly at him. "It's been a long time, Mr. Phoenix," the blue-haired girl who had been shot at before said as he turned his eyes towards her, looking her over before smiling. "It has, hasn't it, Princess of the Alabasta Kingdom, Yoi?" he said as the green-haired man smiled and the blonde sighed, lighting up a cigarette. "Where's Luffy, Yoi?" he asked, but it sounded more of a demand to them. "In bed, where he will stay until a doctor has seen him," the green-haired man said, standing before Marco, his arms crossed. "You must be Zoro, Yoi." Marco tried to think back to the names of people Luffy had befriended over the years. "Luffy is my captain and friend, which makes you welcome here," he said, stepping out of Marco's way and leading him to Luffy, which Marco had to admit he was grateful for. Marco followed behind Zoro but stopped suddenly at a door before turning to look at Marco firmly. "He's very weak, so don't get him too worked up," Zoro said sternly, which only worried Marco further. Opening the door, Marco could feel the sickness in the air, making his nose scrunch up slightly. "Zoro?" Luffy asked weakly as Marco pushed past the teenager in front of him, rushing to Luffy's side, his natural instinct kicking in. "What happened to you, Yoi?" Marco asked in barely a whisper as the boy turned his head on the pillow to look at Marco, his eyes widening in surprise. "Ma, but how? Am I hallucination thingy?" He tried to get out as Marco chuckled quietly. "No, you're not hallucinating, my boy, I'm here, Yoi." He took Luffy's hand and frowned a little more when he felt how warm it was. "This island doesn't have much, but I know the greatest doctor you'll ever find, Yoi," he said as Zoro nodded. "Please help us?" Zoro asked, but Marco could easily see that if it wasn't him the boy was talking to, he would never beg someone this easily. "Zoro," Luffy whispered out, his brown hazy eyes set firmly on his best friend. "That's what I intend to do. Luffy, I know a doctor who can heal pretty much everything, I'm taking you to her now, Yoi." Marco said, his heart beating rapidly in his chest. While he knew bringing Luffy to her right away was needed, he also knew that Kariha wouldn't like sudden guests being dropped on her. Looking at the boy and his pale features almost made him not care about the anger of an old witch if it meant saving his little brother. "No," Luffy said quietly, but it was loud enough to fill the room, pulling Marco out of his thoughts. "Luffy, your brother is here to help you, accept it please," Zoro said, kneeling down beside Luffy's bedside and looked at his friend carefully. The two locked eyes for a small moment, but it was enough for Zoro to understand. "Have it your way, Captain," he sighed, standing up and rubbing the back of his head. "You're not staying sick while I'm around, Luffy, I'll take you first, Yoi." Marco's voice left no room to argue, but even he couldn't help looking between the two of them and how they had interacted. It had reminded him of how he and Pops communicated sometimes. "No," Luffy repeated as Zoro smirked, crossing his arms and nodded, making Marco's protective nature flare up. "I love your stubborn nature, Luffy, I really do, but this is not the time for you to talk back to me, Yoi." He sounded like a mother scolding their child, so Zoro had to bit his lip ever so slightly to ensure he didn't laugh. "Take Nami first, she's my nakama," he said, looking at Marco. The fire that burned in Luffy's eyes reminded him so much of Pop Spark that all he could do was stare. "Where is she?" Marco asked, brushing a piece of Luffy's hair out of his face, his eyes gently as he looked at the boy fondly. "I'll take you to her," a voice said at the door as Zoro's brow twitched in annoyance, but Marco paid no attention to that. "Watch over him for me, Yoi," Marco said to Zoro, who almost laughed. "Of course. Are there any clues as to what caused the sickness, Yoi?" Marco asked the blonde who had put out his smoke since they were drawing closer to the woman's room. "Mosshead and I were there when Luffy collapsed," he started calmly, because even he was on his last nerve. "He was quiet for a few hours, just sitting on the figurehead, so we were all a little worried about him." Marco hummed a little, taking in that Luffy's old habit of running to the figurehead when he wanted to think or just some quiet time was still there. Did he say anything was bothering him, Yoi? He was thinking about a fight he had on the last island we visited. He was able to do something he didn't understand, but we didn't get much further than that because he got sick so quickly. The blonde stopped at the door that led to the sick girl. He was scratching his chest a bit, if that helps any, but none of us are doctors, he said sadly, which pulled at Marco's heartstrings. "What's your name, kid?" he asked him as the blonde smiled ever so slightly. "Sanji, we're counting on you." Marco nodded, pushing the door open, but placed a hand on Sanji's shoulder for a short moment. "You did well, thank you, Yoi." When Marco entered the room, the atmosphere was even worse than with Luffy, so he knelt down quietly beside the girl's bed, waking her up with a light touch to her cheek. She got out as he took in the redness of her cheeks and the sweat on her forehead. "My name is Marco and I'm here to help, Yoi," he said gently, not wanting to cause her any pain. She seemed so fragile at this moment. That is the end, so thanks for watching. Comment down below with recommendations on what fanfic I should do next. And remember to like and subscribe to my channel.